Welcome to the third module of the UNITAR and UNDESA and Permanent Mission of Switzerland QCPR policy review of the operational activities for development. Thanks for being with us today. We have an exciting day. Is one of the most pressing issues and the normal circumstance, finance for development. And in particular for the operational activities for development. These initiatives is done thanks to the support of the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. Is a collaborative undertaking by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs and by UNITAR. So before we start, I would like to have a few reminders for you, a kind of clearinghouse administration. Please identify properly in the platform to know who you represent and who you are. Please participate. This is not a lecture series, it's exchange of views and knowledge. Your comments or questions are vital for the process of learning and understanding. Finally, all materials that we are discussing during the 3 modules as today will be available to you. We will put it in a package and we also will reorganize in the future by September and new sessions to review all the previous modules. So if you are interested in any other particular topics that you wanted to address in the module 4 in September, please let us know, email us, and we will be happy to take into consideration for enhance the information to you. Our purpose is basically to give you the best information, the best tools, and for you to exchange and to be able to talk for saying something in this format due to situation we live in now, with the best people on the areas that their expertise are in the high positions in the UN Secretariat, being the Economic and Social Affairs Department, being in the permanent missions, being on non-governmental organizations. So please participate. A few words also about the program. This is module 3, is under title Funding UN Operational Activities for Development and Financing SDGs. The objective is to present an overview of the funding of the UN operational activities for development. We will see the current trends and issues, as well as progress and challenges on the implementation on related mandates. These sessions will review the funding compass objectives and key elements, which emphasizes greatest transparency and accountability on the part of the system in exchange of higher quality and more predictable resources. We also will try to put together the recent progress and the compact indicators. So we have the set of panelists today include Barbara Adams, a senior policy analyst at the Global Sea Policy Forum. I'm going to say a few words about her in a couple of minutes, but I would like to also thank the ASD, Elliot Harris, UN Chief Economist, Assistant Secretary General of UNDESA for his time today. Sina Mungla, Chief Operational Activities Policy Branch, UNDESA. Martin Engels from the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands, and also Lars, I'll avoid the last name, I cannot pronounce it, sorry. And then we have a set of discussants, Ulrika Richardson for the Development Coordinator of Kosovo, Silke Weinlich, Senior Researcher for the German Development Institute, and Shaikh or Moni, as Marcus indicators he like to be called, is a consultant at the World Bank. And then we will have closing remarks by our moderator and by Mr. Marcus Ridley for the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. Between the topics, we will have these, as I mentioned, financing SDGs and the role of the RCs and the UNCTs, latest trends and key issues on system-wide funding, the funding compact, and the improving the effectiveness and efficiency of business operation issues, commitments, and further steps on this direction. As I said, Barbara Adams accepted to be our moderator. She is a senior policy analyst for the Global Policy Forum. She has a long-standing career as a UN official, where she served in different capacities, also has been a consultant for UNICEF, a member of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, but I also served as a task force of the President of the General Assembly for the MDGs 210 Summit, has write a lot of articles and publications. And so we are very pleased and be honored also to have her accepting to moderate this panel today. Has been indicated that she's like to steer things in the wrong direction, for saying kind words. I like that you are smiling, Barbara. With these little remarks, I am very happy to yield to you, and thank you once again on behalf of our panelists and from UNITAR for doing this, from the Permanent Mission of Switzerland, and yield to you for guiding us in this conversation today. Barbara?
Thank you very much, Marco, and greetings to everyone. I think we're going to have strong participation, as we see from member states, from the UN system, from researchers and analysts. And as Marco has already outlined, this is the third in a series with regard to preparations for the 2020 QCPR. I think we can now call it the QCPR. We don't have to struggle through those quadrennial words. And this module is taking place at a very interesting time for those of us like me who are following a number of UN policy processes. Last Friday, the 26th of June, was the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter. And we are, for many people, there's a lot of focus on bringing our work into the context of the 75th, the UN, what is happening to multilateralism. And there was also 2 days ago the adoption, in fact, of a political declaration that is going to be adopted in the context of the 75th anniversary. With regard to the topic we are looking at and development cooperation, the decades since the signing have basically been through many evolutions in terms of what is development and what is development cooperation. Whether it was initially support with regard to refugees, process with regard to the decolonization and the work of also the Trusteeship Council. And in the initial stages, the emphasis on development seemed very much to do with economic progress and economic progress for newly independent states. And a lot of the actual definitions, if you like, of development were captured in some development decades. This may be because of donor fatigue, I don't know, maybe just because of time. This sort of morphed into a much narrower approach, which got captured on the social sectors and the Millennium Development Goals. And we know that this now has been succeeded by the adoption a few years ago of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. We've gone from a kind of a narrowing down to a much broader integrated recognition that development itself covers all sectors of society and in fact is relevant in all countries, even though that's not necessarily what we're focusing on here. And also, interestingly enough, in terms of timing, next week is the start of what is now the UN High-Level Political Forum. This is the annual meeting under ECOSOC auspices, and it's become a premier reporting and accountability forum to review progress in achieving the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And I think a number of people working at country level might be aware of part of that, the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews, that are one of the review segments in the HLPF. This particular module, as Marco has said, is zeroing in on the financing of the SDGs on the one hand, and the funding of UN operational activities for development on the other. And our four opening presenters, introduced by Marco, are going to address the various dimensions of that challenge. And I think it's up to us to all draw out some of the interaction and interplay between the financing on the one hand and the funding of the UN development system on the other. So we will be hearing about financing the SDGs as well as funding issues. Martin, I think, is going to talk in more detail about an agreement and understanding between the UN development system and member state contributors as captured in last year's signing of the funding compact. And we will also hear from Lars, hopefully, on the efficiency, the challenges for the UN delivery, particularly with regard to country support. I'd like to say to everyone that there will be opportunities for questions of clarification, as well as penetrating questions, substance, ideas, disagreements, whatever, throughout the process. We have 3 discussants who will bring valuable perspectives themselves from country-level experience, research analysis, and also partner IFI experience, the World Bank. And that also, just before we start, and I turn to Elliot for our first presentation, I want to let you know that the chat box is yours to use throughout. Please use it. Please use it not only for engagement with today's topic and speakers, but also, as has already been mentioned, for suggestions of additional modules and approaches that you find will be very helpful for your work. The QCPR itself, for many people who follow the UN or engage, is still a bit of a mystery. So don't hesitate to ask questions that might appear to be off topic. If they are, we might say so, but I'm sure that we have a talented group of people that will be able to make most of what we're talking about very much on topic. I'd like to turn to Elliot to start our discussion for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you out there who've joined us for today's event. Barbara just mentioned something that was really important. With the 2030 agenda, we've gone from a rather narrow view of what development is into something that is much more all-encompassing. And it points out that development is actually about activities that take place across an entire society, not just the economy, not just certain sectors, not just health and education, but it's everything. And that does mean that we have to consider a much broader range of issues, a much wider range of activities and actors, and consequently, a whole range of different financing sources. We've had the problem, I think, that in the development community over the last 30 years or so, we've tended to think about development finance as something that goes from one government to another. And that was, I think, a side effect of that older, more limited view of what the development process actually is. And it's a bit difficult for us now to step past that. I think that is the challenge that we face going forward. So I'd like to structure my remarks around 4 basic topics. First, that we're talking about a range of financing. I'm going to put that up there first, because that is what we are talking about here in this module. Secondly, that there is a whole range of activities and consequently a whole different set of actors who are involved. Thirdly, that there is therefore a need for a matching between the sources of financing, the activities, and the actors who are going to carry them out. And then fourth, I'd spend the last bit of the presentation talking about what the role of the UN country team could be in this context. So to kick it off, when we look at the question of financing, it's a departure. It's not only about ODA. In fact, I'm going to go so far and I'm going to assert that ODA now is probably the smallest individual component of the whole range of different financing. And consequently, we have to be looking at the types of financing and the issues associated with each of them. Now, on the one hand, I think we tend to have this assumption, if you will, that for low-income developing countries, it's all about ODA, or primarily about ODA. Nothing could be further from the truth. The ODA is actually a rather small component of the actual spending that governments do, and it's domestic resources, above all, that are the major source of funding and financing for the activities the government undertake. But we also have money coming in on the official side, the public side, from national and regional development banks, from the multilateral development banks, from other international financing organizations, and from bilateral donors as part of the overall development cooperation. So a whole range of different sources of financing that are public. But increasingly, we realize that that's not the whole story. We have a lot of money that comes in also from the private sector, domestic and foreign. It comes from banks, from local investors, from local financial financing initiatives, from debt. And on the foreign side, it comes in from banks, from bond markets, there's foreign direct investment, portfolio inflows, innovative financing instruments, and again, debt. Now, what is really important here is that the issues that are important under the private financing sources are utterly different from the issues that drive the public financing sources. And we've got to realize that if we're thinking about private money, we have to take into consideration issues like the bankability of the projects that are being put forward and how they are presented. In the case of a publicly funded investment project, you need a cost estimate, but you don't have to put forward anything about the return on that investment. And very, very seldom are you as concerned about the scale of the investment. But if we're thinking about money that comes from the private sector, these considerations become really important. Now, the second topic I want to talk about is that there's a whole range of different activities. Again, in the MDG era, we had 8 MDGs, and there was a tighter focus on what types of activities were under consideration. Now we're looking at the entirety of the human existence. All issues are part of this sustainable development agenda. And so consequently, there's a whole different range of activities that have to be taken into account as part of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So not all of them are direct spending activities. So for example, we do have public investments, yes, in infrastructure, yes. We also have public expenditures for operation and maintenance of that infrastructure. So for example, we talk about water and sanitation infrastructure, roads, whatever it might be. But we also have a lot of expenditures in, if you will, the human capital side of things. It's the social protection expenditures. In some countries, you have publicly funded pension systems. You have education and health expenditures. You also have the salaries and the emoluments that have to be paid to public sector workers who implement these various strategies, these various programs and projects. And then you have the non-financial side of things. There's the legislative side, there is the regulatory side, there are all sorts of oversight functions that governments carry out, all of which require a certain amount of financing. And we tend not to think of them. When we talk about the public sector's role, we often think primarily about the projects that governments finance, but there's an awful lot more involved in this. And that's another point. It's not only the national government that is making expenditures or doing activities that are critical for the sustainable development agenda. We have most of the infrastructure investment is done actually by local authorities, municipal authorities, perhaps under a larger national type of plan. We have separately and autonomously funded pension plans, for example, or health insurance providers, where the government itself, the national government, even the local government, is not directly involved in the spending decisions. We have semi-autonomous administrative units in every sector of the economy, which operate essential activities, but are not carried out by the central government or by the local governments itself. And then on the private side, we have some activity in providing sustainable infrastructure. We have a lot of activity in providing health and education services. Sometimes we have activities that are done on government contract. Some are done on a fee-for-service basis. There's a whole range of different permutations here. We also have to take into account that fact that we have so many different types of activities means that there are different time horizons. There are the one-off type expenditures, there are constant payments, there are intermittent payments, there are regularly monthly payments like salaries. And so all of these are elements of the financing and of the activities and of the implementation of the sustainable development agenda in a given country that have to be taken into account if we want to do the financing well. And this leads me to the third point, that there needs to be an effort, an explicit effort at matching the different sources and types of financing to the different activities and the actors. And one has to have a clear sense of who will be doing what if one is to have a properly cogent and consistent approach to financing the SDGs. I think this is where, in particular, the UN country team can help. We can provide, I think, advice and support to countries in three really important areas. The first is on operationalizing that national strategy for sustainable development. Many times we don't have a fully costed expertise in these various areas can help with that. I think it's really important as well to undertake a proper sequencing of the interventions. Some things have to be in place before other things can succeed. We need to understand what those appropriate sequences are. And then thirdly, the question of monitoring progress and outcomes to make sure that we are actually achieving the kind of progress that we want. Secondly, it's a question of this matching of players to the activities. There are certain activities that have to be carried out, but they don't all have to be carried out by the public sector. Which ones can be done by the private sector standing alone or working in partnership with the government? Which one can be done by other stakeholders from civil society and so on? And how does one ensure that those partners are aware of their role in the whole picture, that they understand what the objective of the interventions are going to be, the timing, the sequencing issues? All of those are elements of a successful partnership for their implementation. And then third, this whole question of how do you match the activity to the funding source or the financing? What source is most appropriate? There are some things that are best financed by domestic resources and not foreign. There are some things that are best financed by public resources and not private. And what are the implications of the choices of the funding over time? So for example, if we have social protection expenditures that are being financed by contribution-based systems, as opposed to social protection expenditures that are financed out of the general government budget, those are implications that vary quite substantially when you look at them over time. What about the question of earmarking certain flows of revenues? So for example, proceeds from a carbon tax for certain types of expenditures. Those too are considerations that need to be taken into account. And then more than anything else, I think, is this issue of understanding when and where the non-government sector has a role to play. And using domestic resources for some things, but not for others. To what extent should those resources be devoted to supporting a public-private partnership? How can one avoid using public money to subsidize the profits of the private partner? These are things that have to be taken into account up front. UN teams can help also in assessing the financing terms, helping governments to decide when it's too expensive to take on a particular type of financing. What are the long-term implications for the budget, and what is the implication also for the projected fiscal space over time? And so consequently, I think these are issues where the UN country team has to come in and has to provide a modicum of support for the countries. And I do think that the integrated national financing frameworks are a very good way of helping to organize this contribution from the United Nations system. I'm a little bit over time, so I won't go into any discussion about the INFS, the Integrated National Financing Frameworks, but perhaps we can come back to that if there are questions on that issue. So Barbara, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. You've drawn a very broad and integrated map of so many of the dimensions involved in financing. And I think there are many that we will be coming back to throughout this session. I mean, right off the bat, you talked about where ODA fits into the pattern. And I think that one of the discussions taking place right now is actually the balance between which ODA should be used to leverage, for example, private funds, and the extent to which it should be used to secure those valuable public services that don't get funded another way. The whole tussle, if you like, between counter-cyclical and pro-cyclical, and so much of the SDGs we want to achieve are relying also on counter-cyclical funding. I think also the whole breakdown of public and private and what they can finance, so to speak, with that regard. And if I can push the public sector conversation a little bit further, how important that is in many cases, because the public sector, for example, is still the primary employer of women. So if we're talking about the importance also for development with regard to gender equality, there are a variety of, in other words, all I'm doing is making it even more complicated, right? But this is okay, because this is at the beginning of this session, and we have participants coming next that are going to make us focus on some specific areas. And I'm going to turn to Zena straight away to start this, who is going to basically give us a what will I call it? It's more than a bird's eye view. She's going to help us become very familiar with a lot, not only of the aggregate numbers, but some of the actual flows and balances involved in the funding side, the funding of UN operational activities. Zina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues, everybody. So as Barbara said, I'm in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to give you an overview of the latest trends in the funding of the UN development system. And the idea is to touch on some of the key issues connected to the funding, and that is towards preparing you for the discussion of the QCPR in the fall. The data I will be referring to is based on the funding analysis chapter of the Secretary General's QCPR report. This year it was presented as an addendum to the report instead of a part of it. The data covers the calendar year 2018. Very often we get a question, why 2018 data, why not 2019 data? It's an issue of closing the books at the end of December, January of a particular year, waiting till all expenditures come in, then checking the data, then each entity sends the data to the CEB, who then compiles it. So it takes about, give or take, 9 months for us to get the data in a form where we can compile and analyze it. That is why, what we're talking about is 2018 data that is presented to the operational activities segment in May of a certain year. Now, funding represents a key component of the QCPR because it has a big impact on the effectiveness of UN operational activities for development. About a quarter of the QCPR 2016 resolution and 2018 repositioning resolution was devoted to the topic of funding. Moving on to the first slide, if I may ask Pelayo to turn to it. Elliot told us about financing. Let me just start with an important distinction, funding versus financing. Elliot spoke to us about financing and the role of the UN development system in helping the country to secure financing for the SDGs and their national development plans. What I will be talking about will be on funding the UN development system. Very often we see the terms are used interchangeably, but they shouldn't be because they mean very different things. So when we say funding, we're talking about financial resources that flow through the UN development system. Financing, on the other hand, has a broader contextual meaning, as we heard from Elliot, such as when we're talking about financing the SDGs. He spoke about, he touched base on the INFF's, the financing frameworks, the strategies. So this is financing, not funding. On the other hand, at country level, in most UN agencies, you have funding strategies, and that is one or more UN entities seeking to identify potential donors to fund a UN activity. Moving on to the next slide, let me give you an overview of how much we're talking about and what are the percentages here. So this chart in front of you shows you the distribution of resources spent by the UN development system, by the UN actually as a whole, across different types of activities that the system engages in. You will see that 19% of resources are spent on peace operations, 10% on the global agenda and specialized assistance, and 71% on operational activities for development. The resources that we refer to in the QCPR are the 71% on operational activities for development. So what we're talking about here is 35.9, almost $36 billion. And this $36 billion covers both development assistance and humanitarian assistance. As you can see, we are at a stage where they're almost equal. 35% on development action and 36% on humanitarian action. Moving on to the next slide, please. let's have a quick look about the long-term trends in terms of the core and non-core funding. What, we usually speak in the QCPR of two distinct types of resources, core and non-core. Core resources are not earmarked and can be commingled with other resources without restrictions. They include both voluntary and assessed contributions. The allocation of these funds is directly linked to the mandate and strategic plans of individual UN entities as they are legislated by their governing bodies. Non-core resources, on the other hand, are earmarked and thus restricted in their allocation and their application. There is therefore not necessarily a direct link between activities that are funded from non-core and the mandates and the strategic plans of individual entities and or the system. Now, non-core resources can be more or less earmarked. This is up to the donor. A strict level of earmarking can really complicate national ownership because the contributor has a say on how the resources are spent. If you look at the slide in terms of the trends, you can see that over the past 15 years, there has been a robust growth in total funding, but also there has been a fundamental change in the type of funding that the system receives. You can see that during this period of the past 15 years, almost all the growth in funding has been in the form of non-core resources. This is the green part of on the left side, on the left graph. In 2007, this trend was already beginning to become obvious, and member states started talking about core funding as the bedrock of operational activities for development. You will hear this a lot in the discussion, in the negotiation of resolutions about core funding as the bedrock of operational activities for development. The call is repeated in both the 2012 and 2016 QCPR resolutions. Yet at the same time, the core share of the total funding continues to decrease steadily. On the chart on the right, you can now see that the non-core resources comprise about 80% of all UNDS funding. This is not to say that non-core resources are not very important contribution. It's just about the potential delinking of these resources from the mandates and the strategic plans, which are within the purview of governing bodies. There's also another important element in that governing bodies decide on the formula for resource allocation. And these funds do not necessarily, very often do not actually follow the same formula. Finally, one more point about non-core funding. Not all non-core funding is equally restrictive. So a lot of, an issue that received a lot of attention over the last QCPR is the need for more flexible, loosely earmarked non-core funding. And Martin, when we speak of the funding compact, will probably touch on this a little bit. Moving on to the next slide. Barbara, how am I doing in terms of time? I'm still a long way.
You're coming to your halfway mark.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to the next slide, let's touch base on the quality of non-core funding and specifically about pooled funding. Now, the QCPR resolution urges entities to increase their participation in pooled funding mechanisms, and it urges everybody to scale up pooled funding. This is also mentioned in the funding compact. There are two kinds of pooled funding. One is interagency pooled funds, and the other is agency-specific thematic funds. You can see the charts on the slide. Interagency pooled funds are probably the most recognized form of flexible, high-quality, non-core funding. I know it's a lot of words. You have to bear with me. These are technical issues, so you have to be very precise. These funds consist mostly of pooled resources received from multiple donors, which are deployed to multiple UN entities to support a particular activity. And what is the point of them is that they incentivize collective work, which is one of the most important points of the repositioning of the UN development system, that of whole of system approaches and integrated policy advice. And in this type of funding mechanism, the UN takes the lead role. Excuse me, I'm getting a phone call. With this type of funding mechanism, the UN takes the lead role in making funding allocation decisions. Now, by 2018, about $2.5 billion were contributed to interagency pooled funds. This is about 9% of all non-core funding. Again, just to make the point, this is the best quality kind of non-core funding. Single agency thematic funds, for example, let me give you an example. For example, UNICEF has a fund for child protection from violence, exploitation, and abuse. That is an example of single agency thematic fund. I won't go very much into it. At this point in time, in 2018, $720 million were contributed to entity-specific thematic funds. As part of the funding compact, the member states commit to doubling the level of resources through both types of pooled funding. Moving on to slide 6, reliance on top contributors. That's an important issue in the QCPR. Why is it important? Because a heavy reliance on just a few governments for large portions of funding makes the system vulnerable to any shift in policy within those governments. The latest available data reveals that just 3 government contributors accounted for nearly half of all contributions made by member states. In case you want to know, these are the United States, Germany, and the UK. If you were to add the 7 biggest contributors, you will see that over 3/4 of all funding received from member states come from just 10 donors. These are Sweden, Norway, Japan, the Netherlands, Canada, Switzerland, Denmark, and Brazil. As you can see in the chart, not much has changed over the past 3 QCPR cycles in terms of broadening the funder base, which is what we need to be less vulnerable. This is why the depth of the funding base is highlighted as a key issue in the compact. Moving on to funding from program countries, you can see that we are at, that's the next slide. Thank you. You can see that several program countries are no longer just recipients of aid, but also providers. And contributions from program countries have now reached $1.7 billion. And half of that was in core contributions, so that is very good. In addition to this, developing countries receive over $2 billion in local resources contributions. Moving on to the funding base, the next slide. The funding base for pooled funding, I'll just go very briefly over this. It accounts for $2.5 billion in 2018, it's still very narrow. 5 governments account for nearly 2/3 of all contributions. Then, sorry, I'm speeding up. I want to get to another very important dimension, which is important to many, many countries.
Zina, you have another 3 minutes, please.
Oh, okay, distribution of resources across country groups. You can see that chart. What we did was group countries in different groupings. These groupings, please note, they're not mutually exclusive. So, for example, you can have an LDC who's a middle income country. And because we're comparing to a certain degree apples and oranges, we thought it would be a good idea to look at it from the perspective of expenditure per capita, because you're talking about different numbers of countries, different population size. So you can see from largest expenditure per capita to the smallest. Your average program country will get $4.12 per capita. LLDCs, $12.9 per capita. Middle income countries are the lowest at $2.56 per capita. So, you know, and I will move there. We're going to skip over the next slide. And we're going to go to the next one. Yeah, we have grouped expenditures at UN Development System expenditures at country level into 3 groups. The first group are those countries which are over $200 million in expenditure. There are 157 program countries. So group 1 is over $200 million, and there are 30 countries in that group. And in particular, you can see the red on the chart is the humanitarian expenditure versus the green, which is development expenditure. So together, these 30 countries account for over three quarters of UN development expenditures at country level. And the top 5 alone account for over 27% of expenditure. Moving on to the second group is 46 program countries out of 157. And together they account for 17% of total share of country expenditures. And the third group, which is the largest, we're moving on to the next slide, is 81 countries where annual expenditures are under $50 million. And of these 81 countries, in 50 countries, we have expenditures under $20 million. The total combined, these 81 countries make 6% of total UN country level expenditures. Now, why is this important? Moving on to the next slide. Why are we talking about this? Because it's important to look at 3 dimensions. If we set aside humanitarian situations and conflict affected countries, there are 3 elements we need to talk about. One is common premises, common back office functions. It's been broadly agreed that common back offices, sharing of premises, common back office functions can help achieve efficiencies. And these efficiencies can be fed back into programming to these efficiencies generate economies of scale and can be reinvested in programming. My colleagues Lars and Ulrike will speak more to that. Second, the physical presence. Just like for business operations, it's important not to conflate program support by the UN development system with physical presence in country. With immense technological communication advances over the past couple of decades, specialized expertise can be provided from anywhere in the system. It does not need to be physically present in the country. And that would allow to take the resources, the financial resources available further. Another thing that we want to think about is some of the key functions and deliverables that are needed do not necessarily need sustained in-country presence. So this is something that member states may want to think about as we move on to the 2020 QCPR. Finally, in terms of functions, for the first time ever, the 2016 QCPR, Barbara, 1 more minute and I will be done. For the first time in the 2016 QCPR, member states came to a precise agreement on what are the functions of the UN, that the UN development system is best qualified to perform. And these 5 functions were policy advice, normative support, capacity development, leveraging partnerships, and science, technology, innovation, and knowledge sharing. It's very telling that direct support and service delivery has not been identified as one of those key functions. Likely as a recognition that most program countries today have much stronger capacities, and the support that they need from the system is in great part more of the upstream kind. At the end of the day, the new cooperation framework are an agreement around supply and demand. And the relevance of the system will ultimately be determined around which drives the other, the supply or the demand. Last couple of points. There is broad agreement among member states that effective repositioning of the system depends to a great extent on changes to current funding practices. We're not talking about amounts, we're talking about the quality here much more than the amounts. We have seen that the current practices are characterized by high fragmentation and volatility. You know, we saw the distribution at country level, the high dependency on a few donors, the predominance of strictly earmarked funding. And addressing these problems is embedded in the funding architecture. And this is what led to the funding compact. My colleague Martin will speak to the funding compact from member states' perspective in a second after me. The ultimate objective of the compact is to initiate a shift toward a higher quality of funding by building trust in the effectiveness and the efficiency of the system. I will not go into more detail about this because we have run out of time. The last slide, there's a lot more information on all of this in the Secretary General's report addendum. And there's also, for those who are very interested, there is a set of Excel sheets in the same place that show you funding flows by agency, by entity. And finally, there is the QCPR monitoring framework that has indicators about all the mandates of the QCPR and of the repositioning resolution. They're all available on the QCPR website. And these were all, by the way, mandated reporting by member states. Sorry for being so quick and so verbose. Thank you very much.
Zina. Thank you very much. And you will get a chance to comment later on. There are also some questions in the chat box with regard to it. And one of them actually I'll draw out right now, because one of the things that I think is noticeable from your presentation, in addition to what you were saying about the imbalances, the issues of quantity, quality, and so on, is also a number of your slides show the pattern with regard to humanitarian and development related funding. And I'm not sure, I think I'm correct, that the figures that you show for 2018, because they're the latest available at the moment, show for the first time, I think, that humanitarian funding has just overtaken development related funding as part of it, even though the trend over years has been fast growth on humanitarian and less so on development. I think that that's the case. Now, it's also interesting, and we have a question from Rachel Pringle in New Zealand that is also interested to learn a bit more about, again, the way in which pooled funding seems to be really heavily related to humanitarian. And it was interesting also to see that, in fact, entity thematic, the balance there is that's seen as more of a vehicle, if you like, for development-related funding. I'm not sure if that's true. And I think that this would be an important part of something for us to sort of get more into as we go through this module. Because we have, well, we're going to hear from Martin-Jen in a minute about the funding compact and how that is or is not shifting the needle on the relationship between core and non-core. But an important part of that transition is also what one could call core-like or more flexible funding. But I do think we need to be alert to the fact if most of that is going to pooled and humanitarian, is it really different, or is it a continuation of a pattern that we've been seeing for years? Please don't answer now. I need to, I really want to turn now to Martin-Jen Engels. And I think you've already had quite a lot of introduction. We're all interested to hear your perspectives on the funding compact. And it's only 1 year since it's been signed. We don't have that much data to show whether it has shifted the needle or not, but it would be really interesting to hear what you think. Is it adding value? What has it achieved? And what are you anticipating we need to do with this going forward? Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks a lot for inviting me for this session. You already touched upon some of the issues that I will indeed address. I will give you some background on the funding compact, its characteristics, its commitments, and indeed the way forward. I've also compiled a background document with all the information on where it initiated, which I will share through Marcus or UNITAR in order to share to the rest of the group. Just to be mindful that I'm not speaking out of a Dutch position, but it's It's just like a discussion paper for everybody to read and to reflect on. And I look also forward to get others' response on that, because I might be posing some questions for discussion that that are debatable, so to speak. So through the compact, as we already, as Zina already alerted to as well, through the funding compact, the UN SDG and its entities committed to provide greater transparency and accountability on what they do, how they use the resources and the results they achieve on the ground, and to work more systematically together and deliver on common objectives, as well as to be more efficient. This all to be a more effective and efficient partner to member states in achieving the SDGs, because that's our ultimate goal. On their part, governments committed to providing more of the type of funding that allows the UN to deliver results, namely more core resources or flexible non-core, and support to interagency and agency-specific pooled funds and multi-year funding. The notions, in my view, that underpin the funding compact have to do with trust. I'll get back to that later as well. Shared ownership and the interdependent and mutually reinforcing nature of the commitments. And whereas the QCPR 2016 actually already hinted to a funding arrangement, from the moment the Secretary General came forward with a proposal for a funding compact in his repositioning or UNDS reform report in December 2017, the realization that we as member states cannot expect full delivery of the impact of the agreed reforms in terms of improved strategic focus and country team alignment to national SDG priorities, if member states, through their funding practices, encourage competition and drive fragmentation. I think that's a key component of what we're here to discuss. So as I see it, the funding of the UN is a continuum, and Zina already alluded to the needle from core to tightly earmarked, and we have to move that needle towards a core in order for the UN to be more effective and efficient and in support of the SDGs. And it's not only about the quality of the funding, the quantity of the funding, but also about the quality and the fact that the UN system heavily depends on a limited number of member states for its funding, and therefore for its reliability and sustainability as a funding. Just to get back to what the Secretary General proposed. So he said, I'll call for a funding compact, an agreement by member states and the United Nations Development System to match the boldness of the 2030 Agenda, with decisive actions on the way funds are allocated to and dispersed by the system. On the basis of consultations held with member states, I propose to structuring of a funding compact around a limited number of concrete and realistic mutual commitments. And those commitments are rooted in the key principles embedded on and have to do with universality, multilateralism, neutrality, predictability, transparency, accountability, results orientation, effectiveness, and efficiency. First of all, I'd like to mention that I strongly believe that this is not about donors and the UN. This is about shared ownership. This is about trust, cooperation between the whole membership and the UN. This is about a broad culture change within member states and the UN entities. This is about program governments and donors alike encouraging core, encouraging pooled and more flexible financing. This is about UN entities that start realizing that there is a few problems that one agency can fix in isolation. This is also about member states being serious about policy coherence, being serious about ensuring a sustainable and reliable way of funding the system. Second of all, if we're serious about the SDGs, about sustainable development more generally, and about combating COVID-19, we need to be ready to help make the case for the UN. as a crucial partner in reaching the SDGs and solving some of the global problems that we're facing as a humanity. And therefore, the Funding Compact renews, strengthens, and broadens the sense of shared ownership of the UN development system. It's a way to jointly rebuild mutual trust and to ensure a successful reform based on a strong political capital as well. That's what we have always said, and I strongly believe in that, that it needs to be very simple and very clear to our politicians on what they need to back. It's therefore critical for all member states to engage constructively in the Funding Compact rollout. The Funding Compact can be referred to as, in our view, as a funding or performance compact. It calls on broadening the funding base and improving the quality of funding member states provide in return for specific and measurable commitments made by the UN development system. They can be summarized in three: improving effectiveness, efficiency, and transparency. So I've listed the commitments, but I won't go through them one by one. But just so you know that I put everything in the paper that I will share with you. And just to get back to how this is being reported on, because as an annex to the QCPR implementation report of the SG, the monitoring and the reporting framework already indicates progress on the Funding Compact, although it's indeed only being implemented for a year or so. But there's more work to do, of course. The written report of the SG indicates that it's premature to conduct any robust analysis on the Funding Compact's impact on the quality and quantity of funds entrusted to the United Nations development system. Indeed, as figures of 2019 and 2020 were not yet available. But there are some positive developments in this, particularly regarding to the quality and flexible of earmarked funding. Although I see as a real danger for the Funding Compact that we wait for each other to act, and member states and the UN alike, or even blame each other for inaction, which hampers the implementation and decreases trust. And important also to apply the logic of the reforms in the Funding Compact, specifically to the COVID-19 response. Some have said reform implementation should be on the back burner with priority on crisis response. But we believe, or I believe, on the contrary, now it's the time to provide proof of the reform concept and push for further change as agreed. We're in this together, and the only way of getting out, let alone getting out better, is to join forces. With initial agency-based appeals for the COVID-19 response, the UN, a bit further into the COVID-19 outbreak, went to preparing the global humanitarian response plan led by OCHA and the COVID-19 strategic preparedness and response plan led by WHO, and the SDGs response and recovery funds. And I believe we can report some positive feedback on this, because through these pooled funds, resident coordinators are proving their worth in mobilizing UN-wide analysis and response to the pandemic. And these funds bring together the UN entities in the most effective and efficient way, for the entities to work together where they see fit under the professional guidance of the resident coordinator. It has also led to strong elaborations on UN-wide collaboration. For example, as outlined in the framework for the socio-economic response. It's interesting enough, all these pooled funds remain largely underfunded. So that is still an incredible a challenge, to say the least. So let me also emphasize a number of specific concerns on the follow-up of the Funding Compact that could also be discussed within the upcoming QCPR process. An area of concern on the member state side is the lack of support for the reinvigorated resident coordinator system. The Secretary General expressed concern in his report over what he calls the prevalence of competition and exclusion instead of cooperation and joining. Because we see the funding compact also as a way to push for the jointness of the system, that the multiplicity of actors in the challenges that we face today is necessary in order to do the work better and to bring better results for a system as a whole. And this issue brings a lot of additional questions to it. Secondly, what we missed in the SDGs report is a deeper analysis of the UNDS performance against agreed funding compact indicators. We also need to be improved, and delivery by the UNDS will provide political space for member states to deliver on their commitments. And I think that's a crucial but also a very difficult point, as I mentioned before, with regard to the blame game and the way of member states versus the UN entity and who comes first. A number of agencies have produced baseline reporting to their governing bodies, but more work needs to be done in that realm in order to make sure that there is consistency across the UNDS and be compliant to the funding compact.
Excuse me, Martin, another 2 minutes, please.
Yes, sure.
Please.
And therefore it is important for the entities to increase the work on common reporting and follow-up of the commitments. As also mentioned before, the interagency pooled funds and single agency thematic funds seems to emerge as a key component of the funding of the 2030 agenda. And in this regards, the joint fund for Agenda 2030 seems to prove its added value to muscle the resident coordinators and the country teams in order to help countries to deliver on the SDGs. While it's a good thing that the conversation is moving beyond the typical core versus non-core duality towards a dialogue about flexible and predictable funding, it deserves some reflection and analysis in order to understand what kind of funding may be best in a given context, as Sina also alluded to before. And how to ensure that funding actually incentivizes joint efforts and collective outcomes. Because also with regard to the single agency thematic funds, I always wonder whether that's actually an incentive for specific agencies to work together with other agencies, or whether it is actually a way of encouraging them to do it alone. But that's of course all up for discussion. We also call on the entities to further improve implementation modalities for pooled thematic funding and enhance the effectiveness to allow greater use of these funding modalities. And we also believe that there needs to be an interagency forum in order to discuss these issues, which is not presently the case. And then to also make the step towards hopefully what Lars will be discussing more with regard to efficiencies. That's an issue that is still a concern, as some doubts have emerged over the feasibility to achieve efficiencies through common premises in the time frame agreed. And we might need to consider alternative and or additional commitments to measure progress on efficiency. But I would love to hear some more on this from Lars as well. Finally, and last but not least, the issue of reliable funding for the apart from the the issue of wider funding for the UN system, we need predictable funding for the resident coordinator system. This is also one of the commitments in the funding compact. The funds and programs pay their share through the double cost sharing. The levy is being implemented, but the whole UN membership is falling short on voluntary contributions in order to pay the whole bill for the reforms to actually be successfully implemented. And that is a real threat. So that is something we need to address. So this is where I leave it, Barbara. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for raising so many important issues. I mean, on your last point, with regard to funding, I was going to ask you a question. I thought it was very interesting the way in which you were putting the conversation in the context of the wider multilateralism as well. And also with regard to this particular initiative and the resident coordinator infrastructure funding, the Secretary General was seeking assessed contributions, which did not materialize. Yes, I see you smile. But also I think part of what is in there is a discussion about burden sharing as well amongst contributors. And I think your conversation about blame game can extend a little further. How do we actually break that blame game cycle to take the kinds of initiatives that you said are needed and actually require a kind of culture shift? Listening to you speaking with an ambitious approach, which I obviously support, you know me, I wonder whether we need to be thinking about the 2020 QCPR with a transition strategy. So, because a lot of what is being mentioned here is it's coming at a particular time where, in a way, the UN development system needs to be encouraged and supported in a transition of its own activities. And I think that one doesn't necessarily constructively support a transition strategy by just really demanding more of the same and do this as well kind of mentality. But maybe we'll hear a bit more about how, from Lars, about how that process is shifting. I had a couple of other things that were sparked that I'll toss out now, and maybe we can talk about a little bit later on. The funding compact. The funding compact, I appreciated the references to how this is also about building trust in a variety of ways. One of the things, again, for the 2020 QCPR, the indicators in the funding compact will have expired, as it were, before the next GA QCPR. So what is the thinking about the next steps? Is there going to be an independent evaluation? What is the thinking about the iteration? Some of the indicators, and of course you know which one I'll pick on, I think could definitely be improved. I mean, the first one there that has the same target of 30% for contributions to development related, counting on the one hand with assessed and the other without assessed. Should a compact really include and give credit for the contributions that one has to pay anyway to be a member of the United Nations? I mean, should an indicator be able to be achieved because of what you're doing already on the assessed contributions? I mean, what was the thinking behind that? It's a bit confusing, to say the least. And my last question before moving to Lars along these lines is coming back to the whole business of multilateralism, COVID, SDGs, 2030 agenda. If one looks at the information from OECD and OECD countries, it is really noticeable that of the different multilateral contributions, the UN development system is definitely at the bottom of the list in terms of the core contributions it receives from OECD members. The balance between core and non-core compared with the other. Is there a reason? Does this relate to your trust conversation, or are there some legal reasons? Why is that? And what kinds of incentives do you think we could be thinking about to start trying to not only shift the needle, but speed it up dramatically, so to speak? So need to stop and I need to shift my needle over to Lars. But thank you. And please, in the chat box, we are receiving some good questions. Please, please send us more, not only questions, but also ideas. Lars.
Thank you, Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. I'll share my screen. We're going to keep it fairly focused around the efficiency agenda. Mainly to give you an idea of what is actually an efficiency agenda, what are some of the elements member states can help with, maybe some links to the funding compact and the funding situation. Followed by Ulrika Richardson, who's the RC in Kosovo now, but who's a very experienced RC, will give you more country perspective on how these things actually work at a country level, both from an opportunity and challenge angle. So I'll share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
So before we actually, the point, one of the main points I want to make is there's a lot of confusion, like how does business operations or efficiency gains, so the business operations reform, relate to programs in the first place? Why is it linked, and how is it important? And the member states discussions have focused since the beginning of the delivering as one very much around efficiency and effectiveness, and these are kind of very much used terms, but they tend to take on different meanings. Within the efficiency agenda, the GA set very specific targets for the impact of the efficiency agenda. I'll circle back to that in a moment. I agree with Martijn, some of the perceptions and how things are being seen as sources of efficiencies is transforming, which is a good thing, I think. But it's good to drive home some key messages. The efficiency agenda itself is directly linked to program implementation within the host countries. So on the one hand, it drives lower cost. So reduction of transaction cost, ensuring that operational support to the program is delivered at as an efficient level as possible, given the local circumstances. Traditionally, the discussion is very much focused on the cost, like lower the cost, more efficiencies. But within the new UNSG efficiency strategy, or relatively new anyway, the dialogue is also shifting. But there's a downside to dropping your cost beyond certain levels. There's a trade-off, and the quality aspect or the performance of the services is just as important. So yes, there's many areas where costs can be lowered and are lowered actually, and I'll come back to that. But what needs to be kept in mind, there's a quality aspect to service delivery as well. If we want an agile UN system that can quickly respond to emerging needs, emerging demands at the country level, COVID is an excellent example for that. There is a limit to how low you want to drop your costs in order to ensure that the performance of the system as a whole is retained. So the whole efficiency agenda, and this is hardwired into the methodologies, into the platforms with mandatory indicators. There's only two: lower cost and or better or enhanced performance. Any services in the collective operational services and programs we're rolling out are measured along these lines. There's a detailed cost benefit analysis looking at that and analyzing that, and that's how we prioritize the service rollouts. So the whole efficiency agenda is framed around this. So let me give you an example. If the costs within a program are lowered, so you can do procurement at lower levels because you're pooling. My apologies, I got distracted here by some sound. If your costs are lowered in the first place, you have lower procurement costs, you have lower support costs for ICT, for logistics, for fleet, for anything that the UN needs to deliver a program. Obviously, there's more funds remaining within the project and the program budgets because of the cost recovery principles that most agencies use. So the link between the BOSS, the business operations strategy, the common back offices, all of these projects that are part of the efficiency agenda is that they lower cost. And because they lower cost, the project budgets within the country have more resources available to then be able to spend on implementation of actual programs and achieve development impact. That's a very important direct link. It is not the case that because we avoided $50 million in operational costs, that now sits in a bank account somewhere and we can just put that in a completely different area. it runs directly through the program budget at the country level. So we're trying to lower the cost to a certain level so that more money remains available for the local programmatic implementation. This is very important also for the host countries. This is how you ensure that a country who actually invests in efficiency can translate those efficiency gains into enhanced programming and more or faster programs. The same way for the quality aspects of it, like the response times. If we, for example, through recruitment or procurement, we can cut off 23 days for any recruitment or any procurement, and you run 10,000 of those a year, then obviously our programs start 23 days earlier. We can get food to humanitarian camps 23 days earlier. So that speed effect, that quality effect, again, directly impacts the way the UN implements its programs and the speed and the performance of program implementation at the country level. So these are two key concepts for anything we're about to see. Now, I'm not going into much detail. I mean, normally this takes like at least an hour to really go through each of these elements, but what is in the efficiency agenda? So the GA said, okay, listen, work on efficiency, work on effectiveness. So the UN SDG developed a very specific, concrete agenda, what they are going to do to reach that goal that was set by the General Assembly. There's 8 interventions, actually 7, that are in that agenda, and you will see us DCO reporting and DESA reporting along these kind of products, because these are the main ones that we are deploying and globally scaling. The first one is mutual recognition. 20 UN or UN SDG members signed the mutual recognition. Traditionally, the differences in rules and regulations and regulatory frameworks and internal control frameworks have been an obstacle to engage in collaborative operations, to work together, because the argument was like, listen, my rules are different than your rules. Mutual recognition addresses that, because it basically what it says, despite our rules being different, we are all meeting the same high internal control standards, the same audit principles that are imposed on the UN, like as a multilateral institution. So therefore, there's no risk of using another entity's internal control frameworks or procedures to get you services. If UNDP provides services to IOM, it doesn't matter that their rules are different because the standards are the same, the internal control standards. This is a massive enabler. We've got 20 members who actually signed on to this. It's not all of them, but it's definitely the biggest entities have signed on now, which means that this forms the backbone for the business operations strategy in a common back office, because it is an enabler. It allows us to actually use each other's services through a marketplace mechanism. You have client satisfaction principles and costing and pricing principles. One other challenge with the common operations agenda was very much like, if one entity buys services from another, there's a risk that the entity gets deprioritized, because the entity who's providing the services will run their own operations first and then deals with the clients. Traditionally, that has stopped certain entities from actually engaging where it might have made a business sense, but they needed that guarantee that if they buy service from another entity, that their needs are central to that service delivery and they're being treated equally. So the client satisfaction principles are now being signed by 3 agencies, but we're making good progress with other agencies to sign on as well. That means that within the BOS and the common back office, there's a very strong focus on the quality aspect of the services. To what degree are these meeting the needs of the client, which will then enhance and build that trust that we talked about before. Costing and pricing principles, the same. There were different ways in how you charge another agency. If like, listen, I'm doing your recruitment, or I'm providing you with fleet services, so you, doesn't matter, you and women, you don't have to have your own fleet, you can use my UNDP fleet, but how you charge that and what can you charge. So across the board principles that direct costs and indirect costs are included, and that we have a comparable price framework, so you can actually compare. If there's multiple suppliers, entities can now look at, okay, this is my budget, I got multiple entities who can provide me this service, but there's a sense of comparability. So an entity can choose something that fits their budgets and fits their quality needs. So that's a very important, another mechanism that we're using to operationalize this UN marketplace of services where these services can be traded. Now, why is this important? You do not want UN entities to all run their own service. You don't want everybody duplicating the procurement functions and human resource functions, because all of that comes at a cost. And there's inherent inefficiency to everybody doing it their own way. It's a straight up economic principle. So that marketplace requires these three enablers that I just covered in order to function, so that you create a level playing field. Now, the actual efficiency impact comes from the next four bubbles that you see there. The business operations strategy is one. Every country has a program strategy, right? It used to be called UNDAF, now it's called UNSDCF, so the cooperation frameworks. For the business operations side, this is the business operations strategy. Every country is required to have one by the end of 2021. And why is this important? And this is one of my key messages. One of the things we're struggling with, and we have been struggling with since 2012, is that operations is seen as a separate pillar to program, which is a very artificial divide, and it makes the discussions much more difficult. Often, look at the funding compact, is that there's a lot of funding elements available to the programmatic side or the coordination side, but there are none of them available for the business operations side. Now, you can innovate your front end and say, like, listen, we're going to have more collaboration in the programs, we're going to do more joint annual work plans, we're going to do more joint strategies or joint responses. But if the business operations side is not innovated to deliver that, it's going to be a car with only one wheel. The business operations drives the programs. The business operations is the programs. I mean, in a way, programs can be often broken down into a series of procurements, getting certain commodities and services into the system. It's a series of recruitments where we recruit expertise and make sure that our staff has the comparative advantage to support the host country. It is about getting services and goods from point A to point B. Programs is operations. And this is a narrative that needs to be much stronger recognized within the member states and the UN system. If we keep treating these as separate, isolated areas, then innovating one is going to be hindered by the lack of innovation in the other. So the business operations strategy is in all countries. It allows us to very quickly roll out large-scale common services, common operations, because every country has that framework. And it's linked directly to the programmatic framework. So they look at, okay, what does the UN want to deliver within the country? And then as a next step, what kind of operational support structures we can put in place jointly to reduce cost and increase performance in the operations, but therefore in the program. So business operations strategy, we currently are very happy to report that since it was launched in November, we already have 107 out of 131 countries who are in various stages of development. We're quite confident we're going to meet the target that all countries will have it in place, possibly even ahead of schedule. The BOSS is the framework through which we scale any of the services. So anything we talk about, fleet management, common recruitment, common back offices, it all builds off the BOSS. The BOSS is a cornerstone of that. Now, the common back office builds on the BOSS. This is this is one of the largest change management efforts the UN SDG and arguably the UN has ever undertaken. What this does, it creates a single service center in each country. So rather than having 7 entities all doing little pieces of procurement and human resources and ICT support, the common back office creates a single service center that services a host of clients, right? So you can see this, why also the costing and the pricing and the client satisfaction are absolutely essential to that. It allows us to monitor and manage quality and monitor and manage pricing, but also because you only have a single entity to deal with instead of all the entities in the country level, it allows us to scale innovations and new services much faster. The rollout will start in August. We're working on the last notes on the methodology. What I want to stress here is the complexity of this project. It needs to go to 131 countries. So you're building new entities in 131 countries parallel. The target is 131 countries. We have initiated dialogue, as Martijn also highlighted. It's a very ambitious target because these are change management projects. So my teams we had no staff to do this. So we're now scaling up staff. I'm happy to report that, for example, all the agencies are seconding staff. So we're looking at several millions worth of staff time to deliver this project. But the common back office is the next stage of the BOSS. Then we have the global shared service centers. These are not country level constructs. These are very large scale service centers that deal with location independent services, as they're called. So think about payments, think about recruitments. They are very large scale.
Lars, if I may, 2 more minutes, please.
Yes, that's fine, Barbara. This is actually the main slide. Then I just have a couple of key messages, so we should be fine. The UN system is looking at opening up these global shared service centers for other entities. They're very expensive to set up. WHO, UNICEF, UNEP, UNHCR, they all have their global shared service centers, but many entities do not. So we're looking at how to open up these global shared service centers so other entities can use the efficiencies generated by those centers by becoming a client of those centers. Common premises, I want to second what Martijn again said. The common premises originally was positioned as a source of efficiencies, which is not always the case. Often when you move jointly into a premises, it's a new premises, you need to renegotiate the leases. So it is definitely not in all cases that this generates efficiencies. The perception is now much more that this is an enabler for the boss. It is an enabler for the common back office. The more entities are co-located, the better you can scale your operations because they're in a single site. This requires a large capital investment, and we're preparing resource strategy for this. It has been highlighted with the member states before. I don't think it should be the member states only financing this or the UN system. I think we also need to look at outsourcing options within the private sector. We currently have 436 common premises. The target is over 2,000. And that requires co-locating between 13 and 15 entities at country level to one building. So you can do the math on that. Barbara, I'll probably take literally 2 minutes now, and I'll just wrap it up then finally. Now, one question the member states have been asking a lot, like, listen, when are we going to see impact? The common back office launches next month, and then we need to roll it out in 131 countries, and only then will we start really seeing deep impact. We will have projections ready by the end of this year, but these are projections. All these projects need to be implemented and up and running and generating those efficiencies before we can give you the actuals. But by the end of this year, you can see that on the slide, we will give you projections for the BOS. For the CBO, because it just launched, it will be mainly milestone based, and for common premises as well, because the funding needs to be addressed there. Progressively, we will provide you with more specific data and actual numbers as the implementation goes forward. And this is one of our key points. For the member states, asking for impact data now, this close after launch, is counterproductive, because our teams are being forced to come up with data that is not really there yet. As I said, we will have the data. It is coming. The platforms are up and running, but there is a progression to this. Change takes time. So this timeline gives you that overview. The last point that I wanted to make, last slide, how do member states play a role in this? The first one is not to be underestimated. It is very important that member states keep up the pressure on the system, that these projects don't just need to be designed, they need to be implemented. And at the end of the day, it's not DCO implementing them. We design them with the agencies, but often it's the agencies who need to implement this. So the pressure on the system to hold the system accountable against its standards, and we have very detailed rollout plans. There's plenty of meat to hold the system accountable, is very important. That's part of the partnership, and that's the power member states have. Second, consistent messaging across the different governance boards. This is, I've been working this for 15 years in private sector and here. One of our problems is that in the GA is one, but then other entities have their own governance boards, and the messaging is often not aligned. The member states are not given the same strong request to move forward and implement the efficiency agenda within the different boards. So there's a coordination element around that messaging and asks in the different governance boards, and that is essential. Some entities are very large, but we may face challenges if they don't get the same messages from their own board. Yeah. Last but not least, the funding options. Again, this is not, I don't think a sustainable solution is to ask the member states for all the money. That's not the point. But I do think when we have funding compact discussions around funding for the efficiency agenda, it is important that there is a window, an access window for the UN country teams to be able to move on some of these innovations. Business ops is not as expensive as programs, but it is characterized by often a high upfront investment, which then leads to recurrent cost savings all down the line, so that it pays itself back, which is something the program might be more difficult to demonstrate that. So the inclusion of business operations around the funding options and within the funding concept explicitly is important. Business operations needs to be seen at par with the program. They are the same. Barbara, I probably raised more questions actually than answered them, but I hope this was a little bit useful And Ulrika will go into a country level perspective on this. Thank you.
No, I think it is useful. I mean, let's remind ourselves that this is in preparation for more discussions. This isn't, we're very much at the beginning or middle stage of this discussion, certainly not at the end. And I think you made it very clear how you view efficiency gains as program effectiveness. Money saved goes here, etc. I think that was clear. The pooled funding question, of course, comes back again in terms of why we're not seeing more of that in terms of development related, as opposed to humanitarian, which is such a key question for so many program countries. I suppose I do have one big question. You made it very clear why this is important. You made it very clear that it's a big project, a big investment, a big capital investment, and that it takes time. And but on the other hand, I think there is a little bit of a, back to the trust word, a little bit of a trust issue here, particularly with program countries. If it's seen that more and more of the resources that are raised are basically going to the UN infrastructure to make it fit for purpose. And that the argument is very clear that in the longer term, this will benefit program. But that's politically also can be very difficult. I can't help but wonder whether it needs to be accompanied by a particular short-term program commitment as well, or something. There's something. And of course, when the UN has a couple of big machineries to service this, are we running now, you know, a couple of big UN machinery side by side? How is that internal integration between being an integrator, being a coordinator, doing more servicing and creating more of this integrated approach at the country level? How is all of that playing out? What's the dynamic there? What's the time frame? Okay, speaking of time frame, we have about 30 minutes for, you know what I'm going to do, excuse me everybody, I know two of our panelists will need to leave us a little bit early. So what I'm going to do is to move straight over to our three discussants, to Ulrika, to Silke, and to Munir. And I'm going to apologize to them in advance if I cut them off after about 20 minutes collectively, because we have some questions and comments, and I think we would definitely like to hear more from Elliot and Martin before they leave, and then we will continue with the flow. So Ulrika, please, can I turn to you? Be very interesting to hear. I believe that you have not only some very interesting, but also more or less unique country experiences of how the UN has been working.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and greetings, and thank you for inviting me for this conversation. Indeed, really, really relevant and so very timely. Many of you have referred to COVID, and I think that COVID is actually putting our entire UN system and the architecture around it, our relationship with member states, our relationship with host governments. It's really a test, and so far I am following it obviously very closely, but I think that we somehow seem to sort of do it quite well. But having said that, I was asked to give a little bit of a sort of a real practical live example of how actually efficiency gains on the ground can lead to more program impact. And at the end of the day, there is a lot of technicalities we've talked about, and I've followed the conversation very, you know, with a lot of attention. So I have 25 years in the UN system. I'm Swedish. I haven't lived in Sweden for the last 25 years, and I'm twice RC, and I work for a few agencies, and I'm a passionate sort of international civil servant. So it's really a pleasure. So what I'm going to talk about is a country where I worked in a few years ago, and it's Cape Verde. Cape Verde is a small island state. It's SIDS. It's a fairly young country. Since 1975, it was made independent. It fought for its independence, rather. And it's an LDC graduate, right? So it graduated from the LDC category. It is a middle-income country. And at the time when the graduation happened, there was quite a big UN presence in Cape Verde. And so many agencies, different offices, many cars, many representatives, doing a really great job with the government, but really too big of a presence for let's say, when you saw basically the core funding dropping as the country was leaving the LDC category and moving into also the middle income. So basically what the discussion there with the government was, okay, how can we now make it happen? Maintaining a relevant, flexible UN presence that was dynamic, but sort of having the good things, but not costing so much, right? So there was one UN house built for the system, actually. So again, quite a big investment up front. But and then 3 agencies decided to move into something which is uniquely called the Joint Office. And this is like, if you think of what just Lars spoke about, the business operations strategy, the common back office, the common premise. If you take all that and you sort of look at it in its maximum form, how good at, the best it can get. This was this office. So basically I was the RC, but I was at the same time the UNDP representative, the UNICEF representative, and the UNFPA representative. And basically in our UN Common House, we had different other agencies, UN Women, we had UNODC, but fairly small presences. And so the 3 agencies that I was representing, while at the same time being the RC, were the biggest, let's say, presences. But we all set up, we had one program, right? So actually in 2017, we were the first joint program of 3 agencies presenting a joint CDP to the executive board. And it was received well, right? So that was quite an experience, you can imagine. For those of you who've done sort of UNDAPs or cooperation frameworks or CDPs in the past. So, but also we had one program, we had one back office. So meaning everything was shared, human resources, operations, everything. And you can imagine the savings that we did, right? Just the fact of, me being, sitting with 4 hats, right? And so with vehicles, with project management, everything was under this one back office. So really, and that allowed the UN system to have a modular presence, meaning we had of course a very intimate conversation with the government, and of course analysis. What do we actually need, right? What is the need that we look at for Cape Verde for now, but also 5 years, 10 years ahead. And so we designed the capacities around that. And then the setup of the office was such that it could be quite modular, meaning you could scale it up when you needed to. For example, I see it now, I sit in Kosovo. I see how important it is that you have a core competency, core expertise in the office, so that you have the capacity to leverage, but also scale up in a situation of crisis like we are facing now with COVID. But going back to Cape Verde. So basically, we had, and it allowed us not only to provide, because again, we heard it from, I think it was Sina or others that talked about, we moved up, we were not involved in service delivery, because this really, the government knew how to do, right? So we were involved in looking at policy advice, technical assistance, capacity building. And you don't need, of course, Cape Verde, fairly relative population. So it's not a huge population, but fairly complex country with 10 islands, etc., etc. But still, but with that small presence. Yeah.
Can I encourage you to take another minute or 2?
Yes, okay. With that, we could actually scale up. We could have whole of a system approach. We could leverage regional capacities, so we could scale up when we needed to. I just need to comment on something that was said about the funding compact and what can member states do. I see it here in Kosovo. It is very, very important that the member states support the reform. We have the reform a test during COVID. I see the importance that I have ambassadors that call on me so that I can coordinate the system. So that is very important. What can governments do? Equally, I saw a question from Mexico. It's also leverage the role of the RC. We can actually facilitate. We are not sort of a very authoritative leader. We are a team leader. We are a team facilitator. And the role of member states cannot be understated, because I've seen the difference when funding comes to joint funding. Let's say you basically facilitate for us to actually remove some of that final parts that sort of, has this competitive edge to it that prevents us from actually working as one and having that integration that we so much need. But it's absolutely essential. And that the efficiency gains, similarly, they do not only free up more funding for program impact, they support the collaborative spirit that we, as a result of reform, have been able to introduce among heads of agencies in UNCTs. But I think the role of member states cannot be underestimated here. You drive a lot the agenda, with our host governments. So I would just say that I think we have a very good opportunity here following, and then also what we are seeing during COVID, of how we can work better. I see the relationship that I have in 2 points. My relationship with donors, classical donors, I call them member states, because for me, it is not the donor relation any longer, right? It is a relationship of partnership. I discuss with the Dutch ambassador, I discuss with the Swedish ambassador, with the EU representative here. We discuss things. And then we agree, okay, this is what we can do together, or this is what I think that EU should do with its money. So we have a conversation that is substantive, right? And equally with member states, or with host governments. This is not sort of, as someone mentioned, supply and demand is true, but we are actually partners, right? So we sit at the same table and we discuss the same issues. So I think that type of partnership is very new. And as I said, I've been 25 years in the system, and I've seen the system, sometimes I've thought maybe I should leave because sometimes you don't agree with everything, but I think that we do best by staying within and driving change from within. But I see the change. The partnerships are actually one of the biggest and most positive developments that I've seen, in addition to the collaborative spirit that we have among agencies. And I'll be pleased to take questions. I think this is a super exciting topic, and I think it's very timely. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Marco, I think in the last few presentations, we've heard very clearly some interest in whether we need modules on governance, and perhaps also trying to unpack what this partnership concept means, because it's being used. Elliot referred to it in the very beginning. We have a question from Mexico as well about partnerships between public and private, but also we have this concept of partnership. The problem with the word partnership is everybody uses it to talk about working with whom they want to work with, but we don't have any standard rules or understanding or accountabilities and so on. It might well be an important subject to delve into next. Silke, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And
we're not hearing you. Ah.
Yes, now you can hear me?
Yes, now yes.
Well, thank you very much to the 4 excellent and very rich presentations. Thanks for having me here for this session. I've been following UNDS reforms for the past 10 years at the German Development Institute, and together with colleagues, I just published a study on earmarked funding in the UN development system. That's a bit the background to my talk here. And I think just to sort of bring together a couple of points, funding, whenever I talk to colleagues about UN funding, they look at me as if it's so technical, but as previous speakers have stressed, funding is really critical. If the current system, or the current funding system that fuels fragmentation is not drastically changed, it will undermine any effort for making the UN more than the sum of its parts, and we need that for helping member states to implement the Agenda 2030. And on the other hand, I mean, not all earmarked funding is bad or detrimental to cooperation. Funding can be a force for change. And we heard about the benefits of pooled funding already a bit. And lastly, we should not forget the flip side of funding is, of course, influence by member states and visibility, right? And we should have that in mind. I would like to raise 3 comments or questions. One on the funding compact, one on data quality and transparency, and one on the role of UN entities. And to come back to Zina's presentation, in a way to go one step further, I would argue that the current funding model is not sustainable at all. In particular, if we think about the United Nations as a universal organization, which is tasked with a universal Agenda 2030, right? There's a heavy reliance on a handful of OECD donors. This is very dangerous if recession hits, maybe COVID recession, or if priorities change that we have already seen with a big donor. Then up to 50% of the funding could just break away. And that's more or less consistently across organizations. Agencies try to tap non-governmental funding sources, but not a lot of them succeed. And there are also dangers which come with that, which Barbara just alluded to. And from an outsider's perspective, the current funding setup is also bad for the governance of the UN system, because in a way, financial investments in an organization leads to greater interest and ownership of an organization, right? And so if only very few countries, or not very few, but a handful of countries heavily invested, that's bad for multilateralism. The second reason I think the funding model is in trouble or not sustainable is that we heard before, the majority of funding now really comes with ties attached. And we have argued that in a way we're caught in a vicious circle. Member states are caught in a vicious circle where it does not really make sense, or it's hard to argue to provide core funding if a lot of your colleagues basically use earmarked funding. And on the other hand, it's also hard for UN entities to reject earmarked funding if your colleagues at the country level in another organization might just take the money, right? So it's hard. There are strong incentives for this funding model to be in place. In a way, I very much agree with Martijn. It's a systemic problem, and all member states and all entities need to be involved. And the funding compact is a systemic answer to a problem, which is good. While it's of course too early to look at the results of the funding compact, I cannot fail but notice that the core shares are not really close to 30%. The Peace Building Fund, the Joint SDG Fund, which are big asks by the Secretary General for sort of which are supposed to be machines or vehicles to drive UN reform. The funding is far from what he asked for, and also the number of countries who contributed to the Special Purpose Fund, which funds the RC system, is at 36, which is something very different to if we had a system of assessed contributions. So the question I have for panelists, and I also think for those who are going to be involved in the QCPR, is why is that so? And how can we change this? Is it about a lack of trust? Is it about a lack of information? Is it about a lack of trust between member states and the system, or among member states? Is there any form of other information which would drive member states to change their funding behavior? Or what would member states who are not so affluent need in order to engage in the system, to fund their own RC system, or to provide other forms of funding, right? And is that a discussion which should be led now in the course of the QCPR? Is that something which should be led during the review of the funding compact? Or do we really need to discuss about this because of COVID-19 and probably the drying up of funding and bigger needs? And is that not linked to the question of multilateralism and support for it? So, second comment, data quality and transparency. That's what struck me when we did the study on earmarked funding. I mean, there have been great improvements, and the DataCube initiative is fantastic, and it's great to have common standards across the system, but still there's funding at the UN is so much of a black box. We don't really know what's behind this biggest box of program and project funding. There can be funding for whole UNFPA country programs at the at the country level, which is good, right? Which is not detrimental, or it can be highly customized forms of funding. So we need better data. And I think at the QCPR, it should be member states who ask for it. Give time, it takes time. It's of course totally complicated to get so many agencies to agree on standards. And so, but we need better definitions. We also need definitions for the sort of positive forms of earmarked funding, the thematic funds and the pooled funds. We know that, of course, agencies and also at the system level, other forms of earmarking are allowed within these vehicles. But up to till which point, right? Till which point does it flip, and then a sort of softly earmarked pooled fund is not so supportive anymore, because donors can come in with many, many customized forms of requests. And that's a big thing, because as we heard Robert Piper saying in the last session, he estimates that there are going to be up to 100 funds at the country level. So we need standards for that. And the third and last comment, the role of UN entities and how they could be addressed or should be addressed. From our research, we also know that in a way, for many agencies, the business model has changed a bit, right? Entities rely on resources mobilized at the country level. And entities, once they have a presence, they're caught in this vicious cycle of having to raise more resources, right? And how can they be supported in overcoming competition on top of the measures which already have been taken, right? Like such as the management accountability framework, the upgrade of the RC. Would it make sense to ask UN entities to report to their boards how they really ensure that financial contributions stay within the mandate or the country programs? What have they changed in their internal processes? Or is that undue micromanagement? I'm not sure, but it would be interesting to hear something. Or could it...
Okay, so here's my micromanagement, please. One more minute.
Last point, no. And would it make sense to ask UN entities to formulate proposals of how to further disincentivize harmful forms of funding, right? Charges for extra reporting, increase overheads for highly customized forms of funding. It's not easy for UN entities to come forward with that, but with the support of member states, I think that's something which could shift the funding model, and I think it's badly or really needed in order to make the reforms happen, and also in order to have a functioning UN development system. And with that, I come to an end. Thank you, Barbara.
But thank you very much. And I'm running out. Timekeeper is not keeping time well. So I'm going straight over to Munir and passing on the fact that I want to make some comments for you. We'll come to it later. Munir, please.
Thank you, Barbara. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. I'm really honored and humbled to have this invitation from this prestigious UN platform. Basically, I want to bring in some perspective, and this is not from the as an insider of the UN. I am from the outsider of the UN system. So I will organize my discussion in 3 blocks. The first block, I like to address the World Bank commitments to the development finance. And I like to highlight the World Bank's specific participation in achieving the SDGs. The second thing, I like to highlight some of the SDG financing challenges from the LDC perspective. And of course, those challenges from the other side of the lens, it will bring the opportunities for development financing in the LDCs. And finally, currently the COVID is really an unprecedented pandemic situation is going on. And the LDCs are the hardest hit of this pandemic. So I want to address one or 2 issues, like how the UN system can contribute in a more resilient way in the recovery of the COVID. So these 3 areas.
Munir, let me first of all, I apologize. Because I'm going to need to interrupt you at midday, I'm going to ask you to go to your second point first, if I can, if that's all right. And I'm going to come straight back to you afterwards for you to address your other two themes. Is that okay? I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So you mean like the second point, like the SDG financing challenges from LDC perspective, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. You know, like the developing countries or LDCs, once the 2015 SDG framework has been adopted and many other international protocols, platforms have been established to achieve these SDGs. So the developing countries, many countries, I should say, are at different stages in adopting the institutional policies frameworks to achieve the SDG financing. So, you know, like some countries, some LDCs which have stable policies, a stable political situation, they are quite advanced in framing all these policies and institutions for SDG financing. But while we consider the fragilities of the countries, like some African countries, if we look at there, we can see they are much behind. So here I want to highlight that in the LDCs, if we look at the last 2 decades, in terms of managing their fiscal discipline, now they have good framework, legal framework, and they are managing their recurrent expenditure in more efficient way. And their target is to make a fiscal space to finance more for development activities. But you know, like in the developing countries, most of the expenditure has been for the recurrent expenditure. So the development expenditure share in the total expenditure is quite low. So on the other side, the revenue mobilization, like revenue mobilization in case of the developing countries, I should say, it needs a lot of reforms, because in many countries we can say the indirect taxes are much more compared to the direct taxes, but where it should be opposite, but it requires the reform, the solid reform to do that. So now I should say, like in the developing countries, mainly in the LDCs, mainly the development finance is steered by the public finance. But here, the private sector finance should come forward so that we can leverage the financing capacity of the developing countries in achieving the development goals. So the private sector finance, because the private sectors are in the developing countries are basically motivated by the profit maximization motive. So here, my idea is that since the world is moving towards the zero carbon resilient economic path, so we need to do some action research that will show the way to the private sector, and there is a potential of the private sector to participate, so we can achieve the twin goals, like the resilient economic growth. At the same time, we can finance more from the private sector. And you know, like in the developing countries, in the LDCs, the capital market is not that much developed, because for financing from the private sector, the capital market is an important platform that can contribute. So a lot of reforms are needed to leverage the financing from the capital market in development financing. And here I can give you an example of institutional setup of the developing country on the LDCs. So, you know, like the under UNFCCC, there is a funding opportunity, that is GCF, Green Climate Fund. But many LDCs, they cannot benefit the funding opportunities from GCF because of their institutional frameworks, because their institutions are not ready to get the funding from the GCF. So this is the area where we need the UN system need to work, because I know like the many UN agencies are the accredited agencies of the GCF, but the government bodies, like the public entities, should also be the accredited bodies from the GCF. So that's why we need reforms to do that. So my final point is that we need to focus on research and development, because, you know, like if you look at the LDCs, the rural sector or agriculture sector can play a significant role to have this transition to this zero carbon resilient development path. So here, if we look at the agricultural growth for the last 5-6 decades, we can see that at first it was driven by the inputs and the area expansion of the harvested areas. But now we need to switch from this kind of input driven to the new knowledge based climate smart agricultures. So this new climate smart agriculture can ensure the climate resilient economic growth, and of course this kind of resilient agriculture practices will help the countries to achieve the sustainable development goals. So here I want to add one more thing, that in the recent research of Oxford, they have mentioned that the green fiscal stimulus will be more effective in creating the job creation and also the sustainable development goals compared to the traditional stimulus package. Because, you know, like they have compared the 2008 aftermath with the current situation, and they have examined the different projects achievements, and they have concluded that the fiscal stimulus, the projects like green theme projects are more effective in achieving the sustainable, like job creation and also long-term sustainable development goals. So I think
Munir, please hold your thought right there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
I think what you've been referring to is a very good segue back to Elliot. There was also a question from Mexico specifically with regard to the role that the UN and the RC can play in fostering public-private financing. And here I think we're also hearing in the LDC context, certainly the importance of, on this case, institutional reform and strengthening a different kind of, but nevertheless coming to the whole of financing question, which is what you started with. I also would ask you, you've been listening, I think, to most of this discussion, and feel free to offer some pertinent and provocative words as you leave us. That's the best time to be provocative. You don't have to take the consequences. And I apologize in advance that I might interrupt you, because I also want to make sure in the next 15 minutes we get a chance for Martin to also offer his observations. Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. If I'm going to be allowed to provoke, let me provoke upfront and say that I agree entirely with absolutely every word that Silke said about this whole question about the need to change the system of funding the UN's operations and the vulnerability that the present system entails. I would ask us all, entreat us all to think about one equation. We have a universal institution supporting the implementation of a universal agenda funded by a handful of OECD DAC donors. Now, there is a fundamental inconsistency in that equation. And I ask us all to think about the other two big international organizations that have a heavy influence in things, and you'll see that that equation doesn't hold. They all fund, not all in the same manner, but they all contribute. Why do they not all contribute here in the UN? That is the question we have to understand, because that is what explains all of the difficulties that we see surrounding this earmarking, surrounding the vulnerability, surrounding the fact that there are major governance implications in the way we are funded. I'm going to respond directly to the question from Mexico, which I think is a good one, because I think it is necessary for us to understand that we can't expect the resident coordinators to take on the entire burden of coordinating and arranging and facilitating the financing of a sustainable development agenda strategy in a country. Governments do need to foster the development of these partnerships and relationships. And I think the first thing is promote a whole of government approach in the way they go about operationalizing the National Sustainable Development Strategy. Don't leave it up to the resident coordinator to bring the different parts of the government together. That is your responsibility as a government. The resident coordinator can bring the whole of the UN into the mix, can facilitate the understanding across different ministerial units and administrative units, but it is the government's responsibility to make sure that everybody's around the table implementing their strategy. Questions of timing and sequencing are important, and again, I think the government has a key role to play here in making sure that the funds needed for those priority interventions that have to precede any other ones are available in time. Resident coordinators can't ensure that. We have to make sure that the relevant actors on the government side are at the table when discussions are taking place with business community, with the stakeholder communities and so on, as we talk about how these partnerships are developed and actually put in place and carry out their activities. And I think the government also must be either in the lead or very closely in the lead on discussions around what activities should be undertaken by the government and at what level of government, and what activities could be shared with non-government stakeholders or could be left up to non-government stakeholders entirely. And then finally, I think this is a really, really important point. As we move more and more into financing that comes from non-official sources, there's going to be a need for the capacity to understand the financing terms and to negotiate a favorable outcome on the part of the government. And that requires capacities that have to be built up. Governments need to make sure that they have that capacity, not just in the Ministry of Finance, but also in the units of other ministries that are responsible for financing, for funding the activities, and that they do what it takes to maintain and retain these capacities. Because far too often you have people being trained and they move away from those positions, and then that training that they've received is no longer available to be carried forward. There is one last thing that I would like to point to, which is that for all we speak about the institutional framework for private finance, and that is absolutely essential. We have to have the right kind of environment, business-friendly environment. But let us not also forget that we do still need to present a project in a way that a potential investor can understand. And that's a tradition that we don't really have in many least developed countries or low-income countries, simply because we've not done this kind of arm's-length financing. It's usually financing from your house bank. And it's financing that's given to the enterprise or to the entrepreneur, as opposed to financing given to a particular project. And that is, I think, one of the big issues that we have to confront, is that there is that lack of capacity as well that has to be built up, this entrepreneurial capacity to identify a good project, to present it in a way that a potential investor can understand and see where the pitfalls lie, where the risks are, and where the potential return can be generated. And I think that is something that the resident coordinators can also play a role in highlighting and facilitating the transmission of that kind of expertise. But it's also something that governments should take seriously as part of their own responsibilities. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Martin, I think you've had a lot of questions already. There's certainly a lot of interest in the funding compact. I think also added some of the emphasis on the recession and the impact that that is also going to have on OECD DAC member support in a variety of ways. And perhaps I would ask you to reassure us that COVID-19 is not going to just push the 2030 agenda out of the way and become the next crisis. As an approach, we tend to usually lurch from one to the other and not address some of the underlying sustainability questions that Silke raised and that Elliot has just reiterated. Over to you.
Well, let me get back to these very easy questions, which I think we can take a whole year for to study and to find our answers for. Just upfront, I mean, I completely agree with what Silke has put into the conversation, and also agree with what Elliot just said with regard to the funding architecture. On the other hand, from like a funder's perspective, the funding architecture as it is for the UN, as compared to some of the other multilateral organizations, is incomprehensible. There are so many funds, there are so many options to fund something in the UN system. It is just impossible for somebody in our ministry that has no clue about how the UN operates to find a way to think about everything that is possible. I mean, we need to look at this funding architecture, and we need it to make it more easy, less comprehensive, and far more focused on the options that the UN wants to be funded. Because and this will be painful. I mean, this might mean that the UN will not ask for certain funding, but just ask for the way they want to be funded. And that goes back to, I remember that I worked for UNICEF for a number of years, and I also know that there was a discussion on introducing a replenishment model for their work instead of backing member states to fund. And that's a bit how it is now with the COVID appeals, and we also see that it's very difficult to actually get that money in, because as I mentioned before, from our side, a huge success is the joint fund for Agenda 2030 to reach the SDGs. It is the recovery response fund, in order to give the resident coordinator the leverage to make sure that the money gets to the UN agency or other partners that are the best fit to implement something on the ground. So I think a lot is already there. It's just like, we need to start practicing what we preach, no? I mean, we need to start doing what is best for the system, but also realizing that for now, for my colleague who's a WASH officer in our foreign ministry, it is impossible to comprehend how the funding system of the UN works. So I think that is something that we could really have a look at. Barbara, what you kind of provoked me on the whole issue with regard to the blame game, the multilateralism, and the transition strategy. Very good point. I think we need to take that up. In many ways, I think also in reaching the SDGs, we're trying to reach certain goals by making them somehow fit within a system that is just simply not working. When we look at the global economy, or when we look at other ways, the way the global system is put together, it just simply doesn't suffice. And we need to make sure that also within the reforms, we have to think of transformations and transitions that really, you know, I mean, that it will be painful, but it will still be the right way forward, because otherwise we try to make something we think that we make something happen, while we also know that the preconditions just simply not exist. What else? Oh yeah, the OECD, the recession, funding. I mean, it is hard times, and it is hard also, it's also hard political times, and it's hard to convince to, instead of moving towards a downward trend on ODA, to convince not only our politicians but also our citizens that we need to invest more in order to find the appropriate answers. For example, on what is happening now with this dual crisis with regard to the COVID outbreak. I think I'll leave it there unless you have a specific questions for me. The funding, feasibility, influence, and the current funding model risk. I mean, I agree with all that, and I think it is a systematic problem, and we need somehow to fix it. And of course, the QCPR would be the ideal time. So that's something for Marcus to solve, but it's also a very big one and a very comprehensive one. But I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
And thank you and Elliot very much for joining us. And as you know, we're in a process here. So there will be many, many more. I think that, yes, it's a systemic problem, and it's a systemic problem we all share. We are all basically caught or happily engaged in that system, and all need to engage somehow if the systemic issue is going to be addressed, as opposed to just rearranging within it. Thank you very much. And Munir, I come back to you with my apologies, and I hope this interruption didn't disrupt too much the flow of your thinking. Please.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I was talking about the green fiscal stimulus packages, like the different countries, the LDCs. Now they are developing different fiscal packages, but like in order to achieve the sustainable development goals, at the same time, we need to ensure the green elements in these fiscal stimulus. So just I can give you an example for that. In Pakistan, they have taken an initiative of a safety net program, and in the right now, and in this program they have initiated a things. This thing is that, like, they are giving money to the people, but the people has to plant the trees, so for planting the trees they are getting money from the government. So this at the same time, this program is achieving the sustainable development goals, and also the safety, it's a good safety net to support the people. So this kind of small things can make happen to achieve the sustainable development goals. So that was my point. And the thing is that Barbara, can I tell about the World Bank, like
yes.
How World Bank? Okay.
Yes,
yeah.
Please.
Okay, so like the World Bank is also the mission of World Bank is end poverty and share prosperity. So this is completely aligned with the sustainable development goals. And like the World Bank has a futuristic country partnership framework or country partnership program with the member countries, with the client countries. So to implement the SDGs, the World Bank is supporting the country-led and country-owned policies to attain the SDGs. And there, I should say, like there are three key areas. The first area is finance. You know that like the World Bank has a big financing capacity. And the second thing, I think like in this forum, some speakers also emphasized on data. So you will be happy to know that World Bank is also contributing on data generation in a more systematic and scientific way. And of course, I should say like in some cases of poverty related indicators, World Bank has been working for long. And the third area where World Bank is contributing, that is implementation. Like the World Bank is jointly implementing the different programs with the member states, and working very closely with the countries through its different kind of tailored programs. So in this way, I think like the World Bank is helping to achieve the sustainable development goals. And you'll be happy to know that currently, right now, the World Bank is organizing a seminar on the SDG 1 for the Africa region. The chief economist of Africa of the World Bank has organized this seminar for SDG 1, and that is going on now. So World Bank is very much committed to achieve the sustainable development goals. And since World Bank has a convening power, and World Bank can engage private sector, public sector, so World Bank is using all these options. And if you can see, like in many countries, World Bank is helping the countries to develop the different bonds, like the green bonds. The IFC of the World Bank is helping the countries to develop this kind of financing windows. I think with this note, I'd like to end my comment here. Thank you, Barbara.
Very good, thank you. I'm not sure if there would be, if we had a number of civil society participants with us, I know you would be getting some questions about the bonds and the unfortunate not good record or success of, for example, the pandemic bonds. But let's pick up a number of questions. We have quite a few questions to put back to the panelists. One in particular, or not just one question, but one thread that I'd like to pick up straight away and maybe ask Ulrika to comment and anybody else who would like to, about presence. Zina made the point in her presentation about what is presence. What is UN presence? How is it manifest? How could it be manifest? And Ulrika's experience sort of, I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, I'm sure a lot of time was saved as you were talking to yourself, as it were, in terms of the triple and quadruple representation that took place. Why do you think that hasn't been taken up more in other situations?
Yes, I think, first of all, any type of presence and model has to be very context specific. And we already spoke about that, right? So we have host governments deciding, you know, together, of course, in dialogue with the UN on what is the needed presence. So I think the context specific is very important. I think parts of the and so the model, I don't think it would work, you know, like you take it and sort of you transport it to somewhere else and it would work equally. No. So that is a very important point. The other one was that obviously in Cape Verde's context, it was very important to have, you know, UNICEF there, you know, because of the schooling issues with, you know, being an archipelago and so on. So I think that is the context specific. It cannot be. So I think it's very essential. Why it hasn't been sort of like used or replicated fully. I think it's a lot of, and I'll be very honest here, there were a lot of, unclarities in terms of accountability with the different systems. So I think there was a decision about using UNDP's back office, which was fine at the time. And I think then that there were a few issues that were raised along the way. So I think a lot of it could have been a sort of a clarity from the beginning, but this was a pilot. And when you pilot, you don't have the entire strategy clear from the beginning. There was also a question around to what extent, was, having one representative being able to represent the substantive sort of mandates of these agencies. So there were some unclarities. And I think also looking in hindsight, and I wasn't obviously there for the entire time, but I think both us as a UN system, as Cape Verde, could have done a better job in actually, systematizing the experience. So I think that's an important point. But I see a lot of things that are actually being replicated. The fact that you have a lot of non-resident agencies under one roof and also using one common sort of back office. I think a lot of what I see at least, the principles in what the Secretary General is proposing and what we heard Lars proposing is actually building on that experience with a lot of other experience. So I think sometimes we look a little blindly about a model and we want to replicate the entire model. And I don't think really that is the answer. I think we need to take bits and pieces of it. But in presence, and I heard Sina very carefully, and I think that is a very good point. Again, the important thing with what I believe and what I felt in Cape Verde was that we had a presence sufficiently robust to actually, to be able to scale up. Because if you have too little of a presence, right, then it's even difficult for you to actually take that step and expand, right? So I think, you have to see, then the nature of that presence is depends on the context. So I think and I agree fully that you don't need to have everything on the ground. I used a lot of the regional offices in Dakar, for example, as I do here. I use a lot of the regional capacities that sits in Istanbul. We don't need to be in the same place, and we've seen that with COVID as well. But you need to have that's why also the core funding, and someone was referring to that. If you don't have a core presence based on core funding, you can actually not leverage, for example, in our case, we were able to respond very quickly on COVID because we had core budget available that we could repurpose, but we could also use it to leverage other types of funding, right? So, or financing. So I think my point here is it's very context specific, but I think you need some robust presence. Doesn't need to be all mandates, doesn't need to be all agencies, because you can call them. If you have a strong RC that is well connected, you need to know your development work, right? You need to know what you're talking about. And you need to have that core technical competence to dialogue with. Then you can actually use that to attract when you need the other technical expertise. And that way, have a whole of a system approach. So I would say that is, because if you have too little presence, it's difficult to scale up, and it's difficult to call on the right level of expertise.
Yeah, no, and I think the way that you've talked about what really enables robust quality presence is also connected to what we're talking about, funding. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
If it's not predictable, etc. No, I think that's good. I was going to ask Lars if he wanted to comment a little bit more on that particular conversation, and also whether he could give assurances, as it were, that presence would be quality in terms of different country supports, because I think that's part of, on the one hand, we've got a situation where you've got joint activity, if you like, of a variety of different agencies in one country. And of course, with the MCO conversation, we've got something different where we've got a kind of a collective capacity that the UN is offering to a number of different countries. And again, I think we're going to face some of the same challenges on the quality and the confidence in that presence. And it would be helpful for us to identify what this conversation is really about, and possibly if somebody from a SIDS or from a country that feels as though they're part of a multi-country office would have some questions or comments to make in this track. I think that would also be very helpful. Lars, do you want to add anything here?
Thanks, Barbara. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, it's good.
I think I've had the blessing of working with Ulrika quite a bit when she was in RC and with Cape Verde, the Cape Verde business model. It is the same principles as when we talk about efficiencies or CBOs or common premises. It's all about the duplication, and do you need the duplication to get access to expertise? And I think in the context of requiring access to expertise, it does not require in the 21st century that each entity's mandate is physically represented within a country, in particular when you talk about low volume countries. I mean, you saw some pretty interesting slides from Zina on a lot of countries who have relatively low program volumes, but still have that full representational function being active within the country, often because the host government feels that adds the most value to the development situation. That leads to a high operational cost and to enable the program to deliver that, but that is not required in this day and age. I think if Cape Verde, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ulrika, but I think what Cape Verde demonstrated, that with a unified or consolidated leadership function, you could still get the same access to the expertise of the UN system, but at a much lower running cost. Again, this ties back to what I said before, that programs and ops are not different. They are the same, they're same facets of the same diamond, if you wish. Same of different facets of the same diamond. So I do think the unified representational function of Cape Verde is very interesting. It was supposed to be scaled, by the way. Maldives was supposed to take that role as well and then embedded in UNICEF. I do think, as Ulrika said, that is one of the aspects that did work well, and that did lead to concrete lowering of operational costs while retaining the quality and the access to agency expertise for programming. The NRA representation is another example. NRAs are not present in all countries, like take, for example, UNEP, but they have very specific concrete benefits to provide, and the RC role is central in creating that access to that expertise. So these business models need to be transformed into a more modern jacket, if you wish. Unified leadership is one. Take the CBOs. You don't need all the functions in one country to be replicated across all different entities. The CBOs are meant to consolidate that, take those functions, not as you said, expand it and create more machinery. It takes those functions, consolidates them so you can actually leverage the scale advantages. Same goes for the program. If you want a gender specialist or a human trafficking specialist and you pull them into individual countries, it's a very expensive way of creating access to expertise. But by clustering this, and Barbara, this is tied to the MCO discussion, by clustering that expertise within a single center, which is the same as a CBO, just on the program side, you can create that access, retain that access at a much more efficient level of costing. And that benefits the countries. You get much broader access to that expertise that way in a much more efficient way. And I hope the MCO discussion was very interesting to follow. It has been focusing very much on the SIDS, which was, I guess, to be expected. But I do hope the element that I miss in the whole MCO discussion is this clustering concept of programs, ops, and leadership. And the Cape Verde model is an example of one test how that worked, and it's been analyzed to death. I mean, we've done so many lessons learned. I myself was 3 times on a mission of 2-3 weeks to that country, analyzing the same model. Certain things work, other things we can re-engineer to make them work. But to me personally, the Cape Verde model is definitely a model that we need to look at for the future of the UN, because it retains the quality at lower operational costs and it enhances the quality, in particular in combination with the new CBO models for the operation side, program integrated programming, and then the integrated leadership. So that would be in a nutshell, I think, my response to you, Barbara. I hope I answered your question. Over.
Yeah, and I think given where we are in the lead up to the QCPR, I think one of the important dimensions here is to really be clear that this is something that is done in conjunction with countries. You're making a case for it being beneficial at the program country level. And so I think it's really important to also be making sure that the kind of country ownership and engagement comes along with what you're very articulate about. Zina, I'm sure this is something that you would like to jump in on.
Thank you very much, Barbara. This is one of my favorite topics, as you know. I think this will likely be one of the most important topics in the upcoming QCPR. Let's look at the figure for 1 second. Out of 157 program countries, 81 program countries have expenditures under 50 million from the entire UN system, including personnel cost, rent, gasoline, cars, whatever. And out of these 81, 50 countries under 20 million. It's not a question anymore that we need a different business model. We've had that business model of a UN country office for like a very, very, very long time, longer than I have been in the UN development system, which is a very, very long time as well. So the point is, what kind, and it's important here. The colleague from Micronesia has asked for further clarification about not conflating program support and physical presence. In this day and age, again, with communications, look at us. We are having a workshop, a training workshop, each in a different location. I think, if anything, one maybe positive spin that we can put on this pandemic is, allowing us to really operate use technology to operate differently. And okay, the one point that's very important here is, in this day and age, really most program countries do not need direct support. They do not need service provision. They do not need project managers. And a lot of the presence at country level are not specialized expertise, which is what most of these countries need. And specialized expertise, let's face it, is very expensive. You do not need it in country 100% of the time. It can be provided from elsewhere, and thus make the funds go further. That is the idea. Is it time for us, for you, sorry, not us, but primarily for member states, and with us, providing you with ideas about how could this be done, to think of different models of support. Ulrike spoke of representation. There's, again, it's, do we need a representative of every or largest organization or all organization on the ground? Representation, again, is different from support. They should not be conflated. UNDS support, specialized expertise, can be provided at any time from anywhere, given resources are available. That is it. Resources here meaning, a human being with time or a budget for it. And if there is less physical presence on the ground, then the same resources, the same financial resources can go to invest in this, in these experts. So for example, let me give me an example from the Pacific. Many governments in the Pacific wanted access to these huge funds on climate change, but they really did not have the capacity within government to be able to put together a program, a project that would allow them to access these funds, nor did they have the absorptive capacity, to take these funds. Well, this is the key role of the UN. You don't have to be physically there to assist with that. So again, yeah, this, 81 countries under $50 million. Let's set aside the humanitarian situations. Let's set aside the group which is in the middle. But these 81 countries, is it time for member states to think what kind of different models can be used, or not? It's not about having less resources, but rethinking of the use of resources. I will just stop here on this one. Thank you.
I think in a way, part of what you're saying also relates a bit to going back to the funding compact and who that's actually in essence between. Because I think that the funding compact, and I think that Margot commented in a way that it seems to be an agreement amongst the member states on the one hand, but then also the member states that are very active, is the wrong word, in the context of the executive boards and funds and programs. And it's not clear to me, maybe it's not clear to anybody, what the next iteration of the funding compact might be. But it also seems to me that we're talking about different kinds of priorities. On the one hand, we're talking about looking at the scenarios of what we need to do going forward, anticipating the same level or less of funding. And on the other hand, we have a number of member states and priorities that are very clear that we need both. Now, the question really is, I suppose, and this is always a challenge in negotiations, is there a way of developing those scenarios without having to rule out others? I don't think it's possible to go forward and just say we're going to only discuss how we approach this question with the existing funding setup, having just had a conversation where a number of people are agreeing it's not sustainable. So the challenge here is to have the conversation, to deepen it, to explore scenarios, but not to weight the scenarios, so to speak, you know. I don't know, is Keith McKeegan? I had indicated, there was a indication I had earlier from the UK that might want to make a contribution. And it would also be interesting to hear any views, if that's the case, on the funding compact and how it's viewed. But I don't know whether Keith is there. Keith, are you there? Okay. In that case, and also with my eye on the clock, I would like to turn to Silke. Silke, you've had some reactions, comments. You know this subject very well. For anybody who has not read the paper that Silke is a co-author of, I warn you, first of all, it's very long. But I also tell you that it's extremely good and has a wonderful title called Shades of Grey. So, of course, she's talking about earmarking, but that's okay. Silke, would you like to offer some comments at this stage?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's an interesting conversation. The question really is, what should this QCPR be about in a way, right? Is it, I mean, next year, a couple of sort of assessments of how the reforms have been playing out are coming in, and maybe it is too early also to say what is working well and what is not working well. We need to have another year for that or not. So do we need a transitional QCPR, which just provides guidance to the agencies and helps them implement the reforms and provides more certainty in certain regards? Or are we in an area of crisis where we now have to pick up the pieces? That's a bit what Barbara said. And I don't know, I mean, initially when the whole COVID crisis struck, I thought, oh, maybe it should be an opportunity also to just say, okay, well, we just make a resolution and put the QCPR into the next year. I understand this is not possible also because of the strategic plans and all that. It's all tied together, so you can't just turn it into a 5-year resolution. Anyways, I think it's going to be interesting to see what the hot topics of the QCPR are going to be like. I think 4 years ago, it was a lot about how should member states be supported in the implementation of the SDGs. And now it should be about how do we reinforce reforms and how do we push them forward. And the question is, what do the current geopolitical atmosphere and environment allow actually in this QCPR? And I'd be curious to have any views of the participants here.
Anything on the presence or the conversations that we had? I should warn you, because I'm not sure we have enough time to come back to you again. So you should take advantage of this moment to add anything you'd like to.
Anything on presence? No, I think it's an interesting time for the UN to really rethink. It's a one in a long time opportunity to do it right now, right? And or to at least change the path and find out what's right in terms of country presence. And I think, yeah, the opportunities now for agencies to second personnel to resident coordinator's office is fantastic. Why not use the lever of a resident coordinator instead of funding a very strong funding country presence, right? I think my question also, I have many questions, not so much comments maybe. My questions would be also to member states in what regard they really are behind what now is being spelled out as the main advantages of the UN development system, right? Is it really that the UN should provide policy advice integrated in an integrated manner and build capacity, or is there still a lot of interest in this service delivery capacity building, which many agree others might be able to do better, or the countries themselves too? See, these are my questions, and I think I'll stop here, even if I probably will have more important points once I'm not allowed to speak.
Thanks. And I actually offer the same to Lars, Zina, and Munir, and Ulrika. I think that if you've got like 2 minutes worth of comments at this stage, yes, I see Ulrika indicating, please.
Yes, because I'm actually have to rush to another meeting, so I'm already late. So I just want to say that I think this type of conversation is very useful. I remember I was at a ECOSOC conversation 2 years ago where I talked about the Cape Verde model, among other things, and it triggered a lot of interesting conversations. And I got afterwards, I was approached by many of the member states, the delegates who had a lot of questions. So I think this type of, you know, and what struck me at the time was that both that there was such an interest of how the UN system works on the ground, to really understand what works, what doesn't work, or how do we function, how do we relate to each other, how do we relate to host governments, how do we relate to member states on the ground, right? So the other thing that struck me was that there was also quite mixed knowledge, right? So many who really hadn't seen a UN family or UN country team active on the ground. So I think that's a very important message here. And then secondly, I think the whole issue around the financing and the funding, and particularly the funding of the UN system, it is so important because I know that many agencies, the incentive structures, although agencies have changed in the way that they relate to the RC, that has developed. We are much more collaborative. It's really a very friendly spirit. We now have to see how do we translate that, you know, friendly spirit sounds like very low level of ambition, but the collaboration is very important. How do we translate that now? And I think that is the biggest trick to increase impact on the ground, because a collaborative spirit is not enough, right? We need impact on the ground. This is why we are, otherwise, you know, why bother in a way? And I think the part of the crux will be to get the funding right.
Yeah.
Many agencies use still a very old-fashioned incentive system, which is how much money have you mobilized? And I think sometimes that is not malicious. It's just we are stuck in a different paradigm. So I think that there is still a sort of a path to walk on that before we really get it right. But I think many answers will be there, and I think member states, and I always make a plea with ambassadors here and and member states that I meet, is that how you approach your funding will to large extent guide our behavior, right? So if you say with your funding that it should be joint program or joint up initiatives, we will deliver on that, and it works really well, but and some donors, I see a big difference, some of the member states, but some not, and it differs from country to country. It is not consistent. And so I think that a lot of the answers will be there to actually drive change, accelerate change. And it's desperately needed, not the change in itself, but the impact of what change actually is meant for, right? So this is, we need to drive humanity. We need to drive, the SDGs is just one milestone, you know, they soon will be over. And so I think we need to drive humanity, you know, human rights, development, peace, and security. So this would be my final point, and I need to run. It was a pleasure, and I'll be happy to engage at another point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Lars, Munir?
Well, what do you say after a passionate argument like that, no?
I agree.
Well, that's Ulrika for you, I guess. Listen, I mean, Ulrika already said quite a bit of it. I do think that it's important for the next QCPR. We need to have a bit of a medium-term strategy and not just look at what's in front of our feet now with the CBOs or the bosses or whatsoever. I think I've been involved since 2005 in this reform efforts. And I think it is important that we now have pieces of infrastructure and approaches and business models in place that individually proven their worth or are about to prove their worth. And I think for the next generation of reform, or the next QCPR, which articulates that, it would be very helpful to start recombining these pieces and build them into bigger, larger projects, like combining the unified leadership with the consolidated operations, as well as the programs into one larger business model. And I think, for example, the DAO effort in 2012, up to 2012, was a good effort in that regard. And I think we need to take that opportunity to have a dialogue around that, like, okay, what is next now? Because it's, yes, you have CBOs, yes, you have the integrated programs. But for me personally, and also as a former deputy in the countries, I would love to see one structured model bringing these pieces together: funding, business ops, the representational models at the country level. The CBOs themselves open up the door within the countries, but open up the door to sub-regional clustering, for example, how you can deliver services, not in each country, again, that duplicating that where we are now. We're reducing duplication by doing it, but we can build on that to start thinking about that in a larger structure. So where one CBO, for example, serves multiple countries. Same for the leadership components. Just to add to that, I was deputy in Eswatini. We were running at, I think, like 39 cents to the dollar for the management cost. Why? Because the program volume is just not big enough, and you have a certain fixed cost associated with your presence in the country. So now we have the pieces to bring that down and to implement long-term efficiency gains and quality gains for program and ops. And I would look forward to having that discussion, bringing these pieces together in the next generation reform model for programs, operations, and leadership. And Cape Verde is a model, not one-on-one. There's certain pieces that didn't work, but other pieces that did work. We have more than enough materials to do this with the support of the member states, but we'll need the member states.
Yes.
Over.
Yep. No, and I think that what has come up and hasn't really, which we need another conversation for, is certainly the whole governance piece as well. Because if you have an approach like that, but you actually get different reportings, different priorities coming through different executive boards, it's clearly not systemic or system-wide. Munir, would you like to offer some comments?
Yeah, I have a last quick comments.
Yes, please.
Actually, like, I want to focus one thing like that I got from some speakers lecture here. So since I was in the government, I can say that like really the UN system activities and also the operational things is difficult to understand on behalf of the public officials. On behalf of the public officials, sometimes since I work in the Ministry of Finance, believe me, like even at that time, I had very limited knowledge with the limited knowledge on these UN activities. So I think like this kind of collaboration with the public sector officials should be emphasized more, so that the UN activities can be more focused and can be more, like highlighted in the countries, in the countries. So that is my point. So thank you very much, Barbara, for giving me the chance.
And I think you're emphasizing in a certain way that this exercise is not a UN headquarters exercise, that we all need to make sure that it's connected, engaged at the capital level in different ministries, etc. I think in a way it comes back to, it comes back. I mean, the word multilateralism, the way in which we have a connection between what the UN can do to be supporting what it really has been created for, needs a lot more work. But, you know, that's why we're all here, I think. I think time-wise, I would make just a couple, I certainly won't even attempt a summary. I would like to just make a couple of parting comments with the 2020 QCPR coming up. Because the conversation we're having here at the moment about the quantity and quality of funding is not a new challenge. And it's been on the QCPR agenda, and before that, the triennial, I think for many, many years. Maybe the quality side of it is also getting more attention. But it's also tended to be accompanied by or influenced by some of the various different phases and iterations on the ODA side as the primary funding stream. And yet with the 2030 agenda, it's clearly much broader than that. So I think that these kinds of challenges cannot all be folded into the QCPR itself. But if we don't get the funding right, as has been referred to by many of our contributors, we can't get the rest right from the point of view of how the UN contributes. Funding alone isn't going to solve anything, but it is a linchpin, I think, to so many of the other priorities that we think are so important here. In a way, we're talking about more collective, more joined up, more system-wide, but we don't have a system-wide strategy with regard to funding. I think someone made a comment earlier about coherence. I think coherence applies in this area as well as in many, many other areas. This isn't the first QCPR since we've adopted the 2030 agenda. But for whatever reason, maybe it was too soon, maybe there were no good ideas, maybe as someone mentioned, there wasn't enough information, maybe there wasn't enough trust. But I think now, if we are really looking at the 2030 agenda as an important framework for the UN and what the UN development agenda is and the way in which the UN is contributing to supporting countries to achieve their SDGs, then we need to sort of really look at the QCPR not only as an internal management area, but also to start looking at how some of what it's aiming to do and its results are really going to pay off in that regard. I know I mentioned the word transition, and I suppose I didn't mean not to have the QCPR, but I do think that the QCPR, the role, the UN development system, and not just the guidance, but the legislation that the QCPR offers to the UN development system needs to not only be internal and needs to clearly connect how the UN development system will be and is supporting the priorities of the countries where it says it is programmatic. The funding compact hadn't been signed. This is the first QCPR since we've had the funding compact. I don't know. I mean, I'd be very interested to see how the process develops in terms of the funding compact itself. Who feels that they're participating in it? What are the qualities of the indicators? How does one go forward? Is this felt like a very important step forward in terms of this conversation, but clearly it also has some weaknesses and needs some attention. So I think that is also something that is accompanying somehow or other this QCPR coming up next. I suppose I'd like to suggest and just toss this out as a final comment, and I don't know whether it has any value at all. Maybe it would be good to start trying to agree on what member states, all member states, see as the obstacles to going forward before maybe seeing if there's some plans for what one can actually agree on. The QCPR will always be a discussion between what we have and what we want. And that will always be the case. But if there was a clearer understanding of what seemed to be the real obstacles for progress as part of the preparation, maybe that might be a way to make 2020 QCPR a very dynamic process that we all want to be involved in. Of course, some of you know me, I will definitely be following it as well. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you today, and I pass this e-mic over to Marcus.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. That was really an exciting, a deep dive, I would say, into interesting but also disturbingly complex manner. I think the matter will occupy us also in the future. And thanks for your very skillful moderation. And of course, thanks to all the panelists and discussants for their rich contribution. With this session, we have reached the end of our series. Unfortunately, from the planned 4 sessions, only 3 have been able to take place. The first one was really a victim of the start of the lockdown, so it wasn't possible to do that. And now, until the high-level week and until this autumn, it's really difficult to find time and slots to make such an event taking place. So we stick to the initial idea of the course, as mentioned in the Save the Date sheet, that we will have a last module taking place, I would say, somehow in the week of Labor Day. We will communicate the exact date, of course, but and it will be dedicated at least partly to a kind of a recap, so that also new delegates who have entered into the system and who will be part of the next QCPR somehow, that they have also these informations. And additionally, we plan to at least let's say half of the session will be dedicated to a topic that you find or you have missed so far in the sessions, in the 3 sessions that took place. I listened to you and to the different questions that have been asked. I see that partnerships would be probably such an issue. Also, governance issues, to whatever that means, is an issue. Maybe a kind of a reflection on these business models without talking about the financial system, financial angles, but kind of a little bit in link with partnerships. Maybe these are issues that may be the content of the next session. And I invite everyone, if you have a brilliant idea or an urgent topic right now, please do not hesitate to write it into the chat, or let us know through emails to one of UNITAR, to myself, or to Zina, or the ones who are organizing these courses, so we can pick them up and try to make something interesting in the beginning of September, just at before the actual QCPR is then beginning. So thanks a lot for all your participation. It has been exciting to have you all here in this virtual room. It is also showing what is possible to do in a virtual room. And have a good rest of the day, or good night to those who are in Europe. And back to Marco. Thanks a lot. Marco,
Hello?
you have the floor. Yep.
Hello?
I have just been informed that Marco has left the meeting. He had to kind of another appointment somewhere. I hope it's nothing troubling. But with that, we are at the end of the course, and I thanks once again also on behalf of UNITAR, and also thanks to UNITAR to make this happen. I think it was a very exciting session. Thanks a lot, and to all of you, have a good summer. Take some rest of this period with the lockdown and with our home office. That was also a little bit exhausting. And so have a good summer, and see you all in the next events. Hopefully these events will again turn into physical meetings where we can kind of where we have more perspectives to encounter each other and to discuss things. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot once more.
Thank you.
The moderator. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Thank you.